Doctor Who, read by Paul McGann. The Doctor was half dragging, half carrying something into the console room of his magnificent TARDIS. It was a massive wooden lectern, an eagle carved on top, and a ledge upon which had once sat a Gutenberg Bible. The lectern was almost as tall as the Doctor, but he managed to manhandle it just to one side of the main TARDIS doors, next to a brass candelabra which held 3 everlasting candles. On the wide ledge of the lectern he perched the casket that contained the Master's few remains. A victim of his own greed, the Master had angered one of the many alien races he had allied himself with, and paid for it with his life. Now, as a duty to his fellow Time Lord, the Doctor was returning his remnants to their home planet, Gallifrey. Safely away from all other distractions, the Doctor took the opportunity to peek inside, feeling a twinge of both sadness at his one-time friend's ultimate fate, and relief that the universe was at last safe from one of its most problematic characters. The contents of the small, jewellery box-like casket were crystalline chunks. Only the Master's dark eyes still seemed recognisably intact. Even in death, the Master's hypnotic stare, now cast in crystal by whatever alien devices had executed him, was still disturbing. The Doctor closed the lid. He dug deep into his jacket pocket and extracted a long metallic pen-shaped device with a circular top, a sonic screwdriver. Flicking a hidden switch on it, he aimed the device at the casket. A high-pitched whine emanated from the screwdriver. A series of clasps on the box's lid snapped into place, and a bolt slid home, shutting the casket. He adjusted the sonic screwdriver, and the casket lid glowed momentarily, vacuum sealing it. There. He pocketed the sonic screwdriver. That should do it. With a last glance at the casket, the Doctor turned to the 6-sided console, humming to himself as he flicked switches, twisted dials, and punched buttons, setting a course for Gallifrey. Behind him, the casket began to glow a dull green. Very softly at first, but as time went on, the glow got brighter. Then a crack appeared across the lid, followed by 2 more, one down each side. Finally, a small hole was poked up and through the lid from inside, sending a small set of silent green sparks into the air. From this hole emerged something that was not quite liquid, but nor was it solid. An amorphous mass, it appeared almost snake-like due to the small hole it oozed through. The front end of it reared up slightly and 2 tiny eyes popped into existence, followed by a slitted mouth. It stared at the Doctor's back for a moment, but then saw an opening on one of the TARDIS console's lower access panels, nearest the floor. Clearly the Doctor had been doing some adjustment or other, and in typical absent-mindedness forgotten to replace the panel securely. It leapt soundlessly to the floor, and darted towards the space, seeking the protection of the darkness. The Doctor thought he saw a flash of movement out of the corner of his eye, but when he turned to look, nothing was there. Shrugging, he turned back to ministering to the controls, casting an eye to the tiny readout screen on one panel. The screen flashed and went blank. Oh! The Doctor waved away a small puff of smoke and tapped the screen, but it remained blank. He was about to ignore it, putting it down to the TARDIS was probably in need of a good overhaul, when 2 things happened at once. Firstly, the time rotor, a cylindrical mechanism at the centre of the console, stopped its normally smooth in-flight rise and fall movement, and just juddered slightly, as if moving was suddenly an enormous effort. Secondly, another screen suddenly lit up. Critical timing malfunction. Instigate automatic emergency landing. Then that screen went blank as well and cracked as a small explosion sent sparks towards the Doctor's face. The time rotor stopped completely and the TARDIS interior lights dimmed, bathing the Doctor in a burnt orange glow. He shot a quick look to the base plates of the console and saw the damaged one, now lying free and flat on the floor. A dull green light throbbed from within the space. The Doctor straightened up and hurried over to the cracked casket, taking in immediately what had happened. The Master had once again cheated death, and had tricked him into bringing his corpse aboard the TARDIS. And whatever form his life essence currently inhabited was buried deep within the TARDIS systems, and would need careful expunging. Careful, because the injuries that he had sustained had caused him to place whatever was left of his consciousness into a completely alien life form. And that made him more dangerous than ever before. Chang Li had been living dangerously ever since he was old enough to know how to pick up a gun, aim it at someone and put a bullet in the back of their head. Ever since he'd been about 9, in fact, just about 8 years. Back then, the Chang family had owned a prosperous corner shop, selling food and fancy goods to the San Franciscans in the Chinatown area. His father and mother had opened the shop from 8 in the morning until 9 at night, 7 days a week, in an effort to keep them and their 2 sons, Lee and Ho, fed and clothed. Then the triads had moved into their neighborhood, offering protection rackets, drug deals, and even less savory practices. Chang Ho, 2 years older than Chang Li, had somehow got caught up in it all, and before long was trying to persuade their father to sell crack under the counter at the shop, laundering money and generally acting as a distraction to the ever-vigilant 8th Precinct. Lee's father had naturally refused, appalled by Ho's behaviour. He would yell and shout that he'd not devoted his entire life to the good of the community just to enable his son to become a petty criminal and ruin the family name. Ho had replied that if his father failed to do what the triads wanted, well, Ho was not responsible for what could follow. Unperturbed by what he considered adolescent prattling, Mr. Chang continued to run his shop the way he saw fit. Until, on a warm April afternoon, 3 members of a gang from the other end of Chinatown entered the store and demanded drugs. When Mr. Chang announced he did not deal, they shot both Lee's parents dead, claiming later that this was a warning to everyone else in the area that the gangs and triads ruled Chinatown now. By default, Lee became part of the gang Ho ran with. The gang's aims were to make life as miserable for the locals as possible. However, nothing lasted forever, and before long, inter-gangland warfare broke out. Not just a few barroom scuffles, but major league stuff. One day Lee was pickpocketing tourists and such like, the next he was armed with a semi-automatic pistol, taking potshots at opposing gang members. Ho had died about 3 years back. A knife had slit his throat in some late-night break-in to a warehouse, where someone in their gang had betrayed them, and the enemy gang were lying in wait. Alone now, Lee had stuck around because it was the only way he knew to survive. Life had been like that ever since, but now Lee decided it might not carry on for much longer. Not because he was able to get out or move to another state, but because here he was, 3 days off the Millennium celebrations, running for his life down an alleyway linking Rose Street and Jasmine Boulevard. With him, equally terrified, were Pick Sim and Lin Wang, trying not to get shot in the back by the 5 men chasing them, firing their machine guns carelessly, not caring who got in the way. Only 3 days before, Lee had got his smart new orange baseball jacket and matching trainers off another gang member after a game of poker. If he'd known he was going to be pelting through dark streets right now, he would have worn something less conspicuous. He must shine like a beacon to his pursuers. Sim suddenly pointed to her left, her long black hair wrapping round her face as she stopped. "Down here," she said, urgently pointing towards a tiny gap in the wall, leading somewhere. "No," said Lee. "No, it's a dead end." "No, it's not," insisted Wang, a couple of years older than Lee. "I've hidden down here before. We'll be safe." Lee stared at them, panic-struck. "You're both wrong. We can't." He stopped as a Crown Victoria swerved noisily into the other end of the alleyway, blocking their way forward. All 3 turned to face the way they'd come, but at least 4 of the rival gang were hurrying down it, guns ready. "Hide!" hissed Sim, diving towards the small gap. Lee did not need to be told twice. He threw himself behind a row of trash cans, expertly avoiding making too much sound. The car had stopped, its headlights having caught Wang in their beams. He raised his hands in surrender and was shot at least 8 times, spinning round drunkenly before crashing against the opposite wall. Foolishly, Sim ran towards him, screaming in fear and anger. Lee stared, horrified and unable to breathe, as another volley of shots cut her dead before she'd even got near Wang's body. As she crashed to the ground, dead eyes staring forward in shock, Lee heard an extraordinary sound. A peculiar wheezing and groaning seemed to come from all around, deep but strained. Without thinking, Lee stood up, staring. Beside the trash cans where he tried to hide, a tall blue rectangular box simply appeared out of thin air, a white light flashing on top. This was enough to expose Lee's hiding place to the opposing gang, and they opened fire. At first the bullets went through the shape, and Lee ducked down again, avoiding them. As the box solidified, the bullets began bouncing off it, and seconds later the white light stopped flashing. If that wasn't enough of a surprise for Lee, he got a bigger one when a door of the box opened inwards, and a small Westerner in a straw hat calmly walked out, grinning. He was wearing checkerboard trousers and a tweed sports jacket, leather patches on the elbows over what seemed to be an expensive white silk shirt and complimentary felt tie. He was examining a gold pocket watch, probably worth a fortune, hanging from the pocket of his burgundy waistcoat. In his other hand he swung a red-handled umbrella. His peculiar and sudden appearance did not seem to have fazed him. He carried a look of someone who did strange things every day. The strange man had barely moved 2 steps before a second wave of bullets meant for Lee smashed into him, hurling him back against the box. Eyes staring wildly in pain, he grabbed at a tiny handle on the door, pulling it closed before slumping to the ground, shaking violently. Lee heard the startled cries of his would-be assassins and saw them rush down the alley past him and the dead man, and jump into the car, which reversed backwards and away with a screeching of tyre rubber on tarmac. Seconds later, all Lee could hear was a dog, disturbed by the gunfire, barking madly, and a faint police siren. He crossed to the man and was astonished to find him still breathing, although he was bleeding badly from the bullet wounds. Lee glanced across at Sim and Wang. They were certainly dead, and there was nothing he could do, but this man had inadvertently saved him, at a terrible cost. Normally Lee would have just accepted death as something that happened around Rose Street, but there was something about this man and his amazing blue box that made him wait. Timing malfunction. The little man was trying to speak. His accent sounded British, Irish or something perhaps. Shouldn't be. Then the man gripped Lee's arm. Look! Don't let it escape! He was pointing backwards towards the door. Lee could not see what the little man was talking about, but felt him become a dead weight. It's too late. He morphed out through the TARDIS lock. He shook Lee's wrist. Stop it! You have to stop it! Stop what? Lee did not understand any of this. What was there to stop? Hold on there, old guy. Chang Lee will find a way to help you. The amorphous, snake-like creature that housed the Master's consciousness reared up, like a cobra ready to strike, watching the whole scenario from beside the trash cans, but hidden in the shadows. The Doctor had seen it escape the TARDIS, but the boy had not. It stared at the youngster, but decided the body was not mature enough for what it needed. It knew it could not remain in this state for long. If the Master were to live again, he had to have a new body, preferably a Time Lord body, which is why it had needed to get within striking distance of the Doctor in the first place. It had to place the life within it into a reasonably Time Lord-like body before too long, or it would dissipate. With the Doctor out of reach, a human would have to do for now. An ambulance pulled up at the end of the alleyway, and within moments the strange little man's body was on a stretcher, being carried to the warm haven of the vehicle. A drip had been set up and inserted into the patient's arm, and another machine monitored his extremely slow heartbeat. "Will he be all right? Is he going to live?" Lee asked, sitting beside him. The paramedic shrugged and gripped his seat as the ambulance started up its siren, rushing back towards the nearest hospital with ER facilities. He reached across, ripping away the blood-stained shirt. What a mess. He looked at Lee. "You know this guy?" "Yeah," lied Lee. "Yeah, we were just passing when—" The paramedic ignored him. "Yeah, right. Is he rich?" Lee shrugged. The paramedic continued swabbing at the injured man's shoulder with a rapidly reddening antiseptic swab. "Well, he'd better be rich, because where we're going he'll need some cash." He reached to a pocket attached to the opposite wall, taking out a sheaf of papers. "Here, sign these for him," he said, passing them to Lee. "I don't sign anything, Mr. Gerhardt. I'm Bruce Gerhardt, and it's just a release form. Sign it or he'll end up dying." Lee took the proffered pen, scribbling a few lines on the form. "What's the date, Bruce?" "December 30th, replied the paramedic. 1999, Lee finished, and handed the paper back. Bruce looked at it, and then back at the man. "Well, Mr. Smith—" He sent a look straight at Lee, suggesting that he did not believe the man's name is really John Smith at all. "Yeah, your friend here hopes you'll be all right, so do I, so just lie back and we'll take care of you." At the side of the alleyway, the amorphous shape of the luminous snake had tried to edge forward. Its skin was beginning to crystallize. It needed to find something organic, something it could get inside and meld with, to survive within before the mental energy, the life force contained within it withered and died. The hardening of its mucous body meant that it had to do something quickly. It had dragged itself towards the still open door of the ambulance and hurled itself in. It landed under the empty front passenger seat, unseen by the driver, who, after slamming all the doors shut, drove on. Walker General Hospital, San Francisco, was preparing itself for a busy few days. With the Millennium celebrations approaching in less than 48 hours, all staff were on overtime. They anticipated a greater number of accident and emergency cases than most New Year's Eves in the past. Its ER department was unusually quiet during the early evening of December 30th. So when the ambulance screeched to a halt outside reception, the staff inside were almost relieved to have something to do. As Bruce flung open the back doors, Lee was gratified to see two nurses and what appeared to be a young doctor ready to help place the man who had saved his life onto a stretcher and rush back towards the reception area. Bruce shouted that the patient had 3 gunshot wounds, adding almost as an afterthought that his heart had begun to go wild as well. "Probably on something," Bruce muttered to Lee as he turned to leave. "Have a good one." "Thanks, Bruce," said Lee, fidgeting nervously. He'd never been to a big hospital like Walker General before. Most injuries he'd seen were treated by a couple of backstreet medics who took payment in little plastic bags rather than cash. He watched through the glass doors as Bruce climbed back beside the driver of the ambulance, and it drove away. Then he settled down to wait and see whether the strange man died. Jim Salinger was the resident on duty, and it was his job to make initial recommendations and judgment on ER cases. Beside him, Shelley Curtis and Angela Wheeler, the 2 duty nurses, stared in surprise at the X-ray hanging in front of them. On the stretcher, under a massive X-ray machine, was the patient. His clothes cut from the top half of his body and the wounds cleaned. He lay still, just breathing heavily and erratically. Curtis ran her pen top gently round the image that caused so much consternation. She then scratched an itch on her head with the same pen, absently. 2 hearts, was all she could say. Salinger could not really argue, so he just shrugged. "I've not seen anything like it." Wheeler was busying herself with further details of their patient's injuries. One bullet went straight through his shoulder, causing no life-threatening damage, she reported. The other 2 were in his left leg, and she broke off as her associate's words sunk in. 2 hearts? Salinger was shaking his head. "No, it can't be. Must be a double exposure." He tugged the X-ray down off the light box. "Come on, people, let's get those bullets out of him." They took him through a set of double doors and into the main area of the trauma room. Curtis watched as Wheeler, the more experienced of the 2 nurses, helped Salinger remove the bullets. Moments later it was done, and the tiny silver tray Wheeler carried contained 3 blood-stained rounds of ammunition. Curtis pointed at the readout on the ECG. "His heart is still going like crazy," she said. Salinger glanced up. "Okay, we better get in cardiology." Curtis nodded, crossing to a telephone by the door. "Yeah, okay, whose turn is it tonight?" Salinger smiled. "Grace." The Grand Metropolitan Opera House was one of San Francisco's most glamorous hotspots. The sort of place that people who had been out of the public eye for too long, but not according to their publicists, went to be seen by the society hostesses and paparazzi. The Opera House had been built just 1 year earlier as a commemoration of the forthcoming millennium. Watching that evening's performance, Puccini's Madame Butterfly were a couple in their early 30s, looking slightly embarrassed as a pager went off in the young woman's handbag. "Sorry, Brian," she mumbled to her partner, as she stood up and stumbled her way out of her seat, knocking into people's knees and apologizing every other step. She walked slowly up the stairs, until she emerged into the box office area, blinking in the sudden bright light. The bleeper went off once again, and one of the smartly dressed ushers pointed her towards a public phone before she even had to ask. She was tall and elegant, with strawberry blonde hair. She had a defined bone structure, along with the generous mouth and piercing blue eyes which appeared to be laughing no matter how serious she was being. She punched a call collect number, and seconds later it was answered. "It's Grace Holloway. What's the problem?" There was a brief explanation, and she acknowledged it. "I'll be there in 10. 10 minutes later, Grace was in her pastel blue work gown, a surgical mask suspended below her chin. "And fibrillation at 300, Jim Salinger was saying. "No blockages showing?" Salinger shook his head. "No, Dr. Holloway." "X-rays?" "NG." Grace raised her eyebrows. "No good, why not?" Salinger shrugged. "Double exposed every time we tried one." "Well," Grace snapped on a pair of surgical gloves. "Try again, Jim." Salinger nodded. "Curtis is setting a new machine up right now, but it'll take at least half an hour." Grace shoved her hair under a white surgical cap with experienced ease. "No time for that, then. Come on, we better get moving." The double doors from the operating theatre opened and Shelley Curtis hurried in, a mobile phone in hand. "Dr. Holloway, it's Brian." She held the phone out as if it might bite her. Grace, used to Brian's short fuse where her work was concerned, knew how she felt. "Yeah, well, tell him I'm sorry, but he knew I was on call before we went out tonight." Curtis just passed her the phone. There was a tirade from the other end, Salinger presumed, watching and waiting to see the outcome. "I'm sorry, Brian, but I had to go. Oh, come on, don't say that. No, wait till I get back, please, and we'll talk about it." Grace shot a look of helplessness at Salinger, but he just smiled at her, rather unhelpfully. Grace spoke again. "No, don't be silly. Just Brian? Brian!" Salinger watched as Grace lowered the phone, switched it off and dropped it on a chair. Grace put on her protective goggles and they crossed through the double doors and into the operating theatre. A few moments later she noticed the hospital's administrator, Roger Swift, bringing what appeared to be a senior citizens' coach party into the observation gallery. I clipped her tape into the battered beatbox in the corner. She liked to have music on while she worked. Unorthodox, but it helped her concentrate. "If I can't see it live, I'll hear it on tape," she said to Angela Wheeler as the second half of Act 2 of Madame Butterfly began anew. Wheeler passed her the microsurgical probe Grace would be using on her patient, and his eyes snapped open, staring straight into her face. She took a slight step back, but then she smiled at him. "Hello. You're quite safe." "Puccini," he said quietly. "It's Madame Butterfly." He suddenly turned his head from side to side, presumably taking in where he was. "Whatever you're about to do," he rasped, "please don't." His head fell back, eyes closed. "Just stop." Grace looked over at Salinger and Wheeler. Note: going by his accent, the patient is probably a tourist. He might not be covered by insurance. Salinger shrugged. "Okay, what do you want to do?" "Go ahead anyway. Something is damaging his heart, and we haven't got time to mess about with all that paperwork." She looked back at the man as Curtis dabbed his head with a damp cloth. "Mr. Smith, you're going to be okay." He looked up at her again. "No, you don't understand." His breathing was clearly hurting him now. I'm not the same as you. I'm not even human." He then reached up and gently held her wrist, as if to stop the microsurgical probe going near him. "I don't need that. I need a beryllium atomic clock." Grace looked across at the other three. Salinger tapped his head, indicating that he thought the patient was crazy. Wheeler nodded her agreement. Curtis just dabbed Mr. Smith's forehead again. Beside them, the beeping of the ECG machine was getting louder. The patient was becoming insistent, his blood pressure rising. "Tell me," he begged. "This is 1999, isn't it?" Salinger was frowning at the ECG. "We can't wait any longer, Grace." Grace nodded and Salinger picked up the oxygen mask, sliding it down the patient's face. "Don't try to speak now, Mr. Smith," she said. "We've removed the bullets, but we still need to know what's making your heart go wild, so that I can fix it." The patient began struggling weakly. "Now don't worry." Grace tried to reassure him. "I've done hundreds of these." She indicated for Salinger to inject the patient with anaesthetic, which the resident did. Grace leaned forward to see if her patient had gone under, when he suddenly sat bolt upright, eyes wide, staring straight at her. Piercing blue eyes that seemed suddenly very clear, very determined, very powerful. He grasped her wrist again, this time as if to warn her. He was clearly very serious, but also very frightened of something. And for a brief moment Grace had the feeling that he was rarely afraid of anything. "Timing malfunction! The master! He's out there!" he said. "I've got to stop him!" And then his eyes rolled back, closed, and he slumped unconscious back on the table. Grace prized her wrist out of his grip, shaking slightly. There had been something about the utter conviction with which he had spoken, the fierce honesty in his eyes. If only it had made some kind of sense. As she cleared her head, thinking about the microsurgery, she glanced over at Shelley Curtis. Somehow I don't think his real name is John Smith at all, do you? Grace began working, but a couple of moments later she stalled. "This is strange." Grace frowned. "What?" asked Salinger. "Déjà vu." Grace moved the probe very slightly. Without looking up, she indicated the screen with her head. "Where am I?" "Subclavian. But I should be in the brachiocephalic." Salinger laughed. "Not unless he's a donkey." Curtis and Wheeler laughed, probably more than anything to try and break the sudden tension Grace could feel in the air. She, however, was deadly serious. "Let me try something," she muttered, stabbing the red button nearest her. The patient's body, Smith or whoever he really was, reacted violently. "Massive seizure," yelled Salinger, darting around the ECG machine, making adjustments. "Grace, get the probe out of there." "I'm trying." Grace couldn't understand what had happened. It was as if the body was rejecting the probe, literally trying to fight it. "I am trying." "Picture's out," announced Curtis, attempting to reactivate the monitor. Simultaneously, Wheeler was checking the patient's vital signs. "We're dropping off fast. We're losing him." Salinger looked almost ready to thump the ECG machine in frustration. "Just get it out, Grace. Pull it." Grace felt she was almost coaxing something living, as if the probe had become part of the patient's body. "Come to me," she said softly. "Come to Mama." Suddenly there was an elongated beep, no rhythm, no pulsation. "Grace," said Salinger, his voice quiet. "Gracie's flatlining." Grace barely heard him. She was staring at her empty hand, and the tiny keyhole wound in the patient's chest where the probe had been. "I got lost in there," was all she could say. Salinger suddenly pushed her back. "He's going, Grace." In his hands, Salinger had the paddles linked up and ready. "Stand back." Grace, feeling disorientated and bemused, stepped back, letting Salinger attempt to revive their patient. She glanced over to the observation gallery where Swift was slowly ushering his friends away. As Swift left, he stared back at Grace. The message was unmistakable. An error had been made. A patient had died in Grace's care during a routine operation, and Swift saw it as her responsibility. So did she. She stared at the ECG monitor, mentally begging for a response. "Give me 300, Salinger said to Curtis, and then he shouted, 'Clear!' to everyone. They moved back, and he attempted a further resuscitation. Grace lost count of the subsequent attempts. All she could do was remember the man's face, and his astonishingly fierce eyes, full of strength, full of pain, full of fear. Eventually she became aware of Salinger talking to Wheeler and Curtis. "Time of death, 22:03. Curtis countersigned the report. She turned to look at Grace. "I'm sorry, Dr. Holloway." And she left, followed by Wheeler. Salinger was looking at her. "Need your signature, too." He held out the clipboard and she took it, signed and passed it back in one fluid movement, as if she did it every day. No one that she could remember had ever just given up and died like that. No one should have to. She looked into Salinger's eyes, trying not to cry. "Jim, I got lost. I just don't understand." "Grace," Salinger shrugged. "It happens." She stepped back. "No, Jim, not to me. I want another look at those X-rays." Salinger nodded. "Now!" she barked. She entered her office 10 minutes later to find Angela Wheeler rummaging through a bag with the patient's artifacts in it. A sling, a Browning apple core, a cricket ball, a long silver thing that might have been a flashlight, a variety of useless objects. Wheeler just shrugged. "No identification at all, Doctor, I'm sorry." She replaced them in the bag. Grace took an envelope from the desk. They were the X-rays, and Grace placed them on her light box. She stared at them for a moment, and Wheeler joined her. "What shall I do, Doctor?" Grace continued looking at the two hearts, so clearly there. "Tag him as a John Doe and book him for an autopsy." Wheeler turned to go. "Do you want me to get that Chinese kid in? Maybe he can give us an ID." Grace just stared at the X-ray. The answer was there. It had to be. "Dr. Holloway, the kid." Grace closed her eyes, needing to break her own concentration. "Yeah, the kid, sure." Wheeler went out and Grace looked back at the X-ray. "No, Jim. This is not a double exposure at all." There was a knock on the door and Grace turned to see a Chinese boy come in. She picked up a pen and waved him to a seat on the opposite side of her desk by the bag. "Now, I'm Dr. Holloway, and you are?" "Chang Li." "Okay, Chang Li, you a friend of Mr. Smith?" Li looked at the pen rather than Grace. "Yeah, sort of. Is he okay?" Grace stared at the boy. He was only about 16, maybe 17, and clearly bewildered. "Look, there were complications." Talk about understatements. "I'm afraid he didn't make it." She saw Lee's jaw clench slightly, then he relaxed. "It's okay." Lee was staring intently at the bag of possessions. "I'll tell his family." He reached out to the bag. "These his things?" He opened the bag, frowning as if he didn't recognize any of them. Grace took the bag and moved it to her side of the desk. "I think we at Walker General ought to contact his family ourselves." Lee shook his head vehemently. "No, Doctor, no! This'll hit them hard. I'll tell them." Grace stood up and Lee shifted back in his seat, ignoring the bag. "I don't think you knew this man at all, did you?" Lee tried to look indignant. "Yes, I do." "Fine, then tell me his real name." Lee seized the chance he'd clearly been waiting for. His hand darted forward, scooped up the bag, and dashed out of her office. "Wait!" Grace yelled, following him. By the time she was in the corridor, he was at the far end, heading for reception. She set off after him. She reached reception only to see Lee nearing the exit. Damn! Nothing had gone right this evening. Sometime later, two porters, Pete and Ted, were wheeling Grace's mysterious dead patient towards the body room section of the morgue. They pushed it through the double doors and stopped inside a room full of metallic, rectangular doors, each one leading to a cold room where bodies could be stored on their gurneys. Ted picked up a sheaf of papers. "Number 8 is empty." Pete nodded and wandered over to number 8, opened the door. "You doing anything for New Year's Eve, Ted?" The body, now stripped of all its clothes, was wrapped in a grey shroud which Ted was tying up at the back. "Same as you, I guess. The upstairs fancy dress party. Going as Wild Bill Hickok." Pete was not sure who Wild Bill Hickok was. He was sure he knew most actors and pop stars, so he just smiled. "Great." He picked up a name tag and scribbled John Doe on it, before wandering back towards the body and attaching it to the dead man's big right toe. "John Doe on the toe," he said to the dead body. "We got a nice autopsy booked for you first thing in the morning, mister. Then that gets followed by a sauna or a Swedish herbal wrap. What would be your pleasure?" Shrugging at the lack of response, he glanced over at the huge clock by the door. "Hey, Ted! It's 1 in the morning. It's New Year's Eve, 1999. Party on!" Ted rolled the body off the trolley and onto number 8's gurney. He then slid it back inside and locked the door. "Yeah, let's rock, Pete." Inside number 8, something very strange was happening. Normally, a dead body would lie there until its autopsy, untouched and unmoved. This mysterious body, however, began quivering. A strange glow lit up the shroud, and for a moment it seemed to melt away, revealing a starscape. Suns, moons, and planets, swirling gas giants and flaming comets, as if the whole universe was encased within the outline of one man's body. Then it all faded back to normal, and the body was lying inside its grey shroud. Normal until the man's hand moved from inside the shroud and ripped it away. For a moment the revealed body lay there. Then the eyes popped open, bright eyes shining with life. Life that did not want to be shut inside whatever dark prison it was in. But it was tired, exhausted. It had to rest, gather its strength. So it waited. Pete was in his little office, munching on a vast tub of sweet popcorn and watching a really cheesy black-and-white movie version of Frankenstein. The monster was being brought back to life by massive surges of electricity. "People don't come back to life," he muttered, taking a quick swig of cooling coffee. Then he jumped as he heard a couple of thumps. He turned. They seemed to be coming from the body room. There were a couple more. "Ted?" But Ted had gone off duty about an hour ago. "Ted, is that you?" No answer. Just another thump. Frowning, Pete got up and walked out of his office and into the body room. The thumping started again, furiously. Pete flicked the light switch, bathing the room in a harsh fluorescent white. The thumping was coming from inside one of the morgue containers. Which one? It was number 8, he realized. The one with their mysterious John Doe. Tentatively he reached out, flicking the catch. The door sprung open, almost ripped off its hinges by the violence of the movement. The gurney shot out, propelling the dead body forward and across the room, where it thudded into the opposite wall. Pete did a double take, unable to believe his eyes. His credulity was stretched further when the dead body groaned and staggered up. The final straw that broke the proverbial camel's back was, however, when Pete saw the body. It was wrapped in the shroud, the John Doe tag still attached to the right big toe, but the body was of a different man. It was taller, younger, with wild hair. The bizarre apparition staggered towards Pete, who suddenly felt very warm. His legs felt like jelly, and he wanted to cry out, but all he could manage was a hiss. Everything went black. Bruce Gerhardt was snoring, keeping his wife wide awake as usual. Miranda Gerhardt was used to her husband's snores. They'd been married over 5 years, but that didn't mean she liked them. Miranda stared at the clock. Bruce had got home from the hospital at around 10:30, murmuring something about someone being shot in Chinatown. After 14 years as a paramedic, she thought, he ought to have gotten used to horrible injuries by now, but then again, that was Bruce. A carer. Someone who would inconvenience himself without a thought if it could help someone else. She was lucky to be married to such a nice man, she reminded herself. If only he didn't snore so much. On the floor, just beside the wardrobe, Bruce had placed his plastic medikit bag. For a brief moment, it glowed green, and when that faded, a small hole had been melted through it from the inside. Something scrabbled out of the new hole, something green and essentially amorphous, but its normally fluid texture had taken on an almost chitinous appearance. It slumped onto the floor, desperately trying to inch forward. Already it could feel the Master's life force ebbing. The mental stress on the Master would be terrible, and so it drove itself forward. It needed something organic to dissipate into, to wrap its DNA around, and combine with, providing the Master with a better form, more suited to its natural existence. Rearing up tiny flakes of hard skin chipping off, the creature jumped forward, landing on the soft coverings of the humans lying together. The male human's mouth was wide open, which made oozing inside easy. For a brief moment it felt the human gagging and dying. That was of no consequence, because now it felt renewed, strong. Its task was almost complete. It filled outwards, its body becoming one with the dead human, revitalizing the vital organs as best it could. It was now aware that the Master was getting stronger. The last thing it was conscious of was that the Master, however, was displeased. This body would not work for long. It needed a proper Time Lord body. Not something as primitive as a human. It needed 2 hearts, a respiratory bypass system, and a lower body temperature. But there was nothing more it could do now except keep this body animated, long enough for the Master to find a Time Lord's body to inhabit. Then it dissipated forever. The man in white had fainted. Why? He reached down to feel for the man in white's pulse, but suddenly whipped his hand back, as if he'd been burned. His hand? Hands? He looked at them. "Not my hands," he murmured. What did that mean? Why weren't they his hands? What were his real hands like? He couldn't remember, yet something told him this was wrong. He was cold. The room was very chilly. He needed warmth and some clothes. He felt exposed and unprotected. But what did he need protection from? He staggered into the corridor and looked out of a window. Dark. Rain. Cold. Where was he? What was he doing here? He opened a door that was clearly marked, no entry, but for some reason that did not seem to matter. The room was cold but full of things, big things. Beds. They were called beds. Yes, he could remember that. They were piled on top of each other, and the room was quite dark. There was some scaffolding in one corner. This room was being redecorated. It was a hospital, that's right, a hospital. But what was he doing in a hospital? Had he had an accident that meant his hands had been cut off? Was that why they felt strange? That aside, his whole body felt strange, as if it didn't really belong to him at all. He turned to a window. There was a light outside, lots of lights. It was a place they parked cars in. Whatever a car was. Why couldn't he remember? The light meant that he could see himself reflected in the window. He could not remotely remember what his reflection ought to have been, but whoever it was staring back at him struck no chords of recognition. "You're not me," he mumbled. "Who are you?" Suddenly he felt very tired and very dizzy. He staggered back and sat on a bed that was lying clear of the others. "You're not me," he repeated. "But who am I?" That was the question he really needed an answer to. Nothing seemed remotely familiar at all, and that frightened him. He looked about him, at the shadows cast upon the wall by the outside lights, at the door to the bright corridor, at the window itself, where he could still see a faint image of, he presumed, his own face. He tried to get up again, but his legs were tired, and instead he just fell onto the floor. Curling up into a fetal ball, he hugged himself to keep warm. "Who am I?" he said again. And inside his brain the words echoed over and over again. "Who am I?" To millions of people all over the world, the breaking of this particular dawn signified the start of a very important day. It was December 31st, 1999, New Year's Eve. For Dr. Grace Holloway it began drearily. She heaved her face up off her desk and tried to massage some life into her right cheek. It had taken the full weight of her sleeping head all night, and she imagined that someone could jab a needle through it and she would not feel a thing. Wiping at her eyes, she yawned and stared hard at the X-ray still lit by the light box. She glanced at her desk clock. 6:30 a.m. Last time she looked at it, it had said 4:10 a.m. Surely she'd not been sleeping for 2 hours. She had work to do. Her telephone rang twice, an internal call. It was Pete from the morgue, going on about the living dead and damage done to the mortuary room by some drunk. As her head cleared, Grace realized that Pete was talking about her deceased patient's cold room. Still not entirely clear what he was going on about, Grace agreed to take a wander down to the morgue, on the proviso she could get some coffee on the way. The object of Pete's consternation watched from a corridor as the porter dashed away, having just finished a telephone conversation about some incident in the mortuary. That seemed vaguely familiar, but he could not put a finger on exactly why. Had he seen something? Something about a door? Whatever it was, he would find out soon, no doubt. If he could only clear this strange fog in his brain. He tried sleeping, but despite feeling exceptionally tired, his mind simply would not let him go under. Instead it had kept probing, kept digging, trying to find answers to impossible questions. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? Philosophically or geographically? By now he had wandered into the mortuary itself, and immediately saw the damaged container door, battered and hanging off its hinges, indentations made by a fast-moving gurney, no doubt. How did he know that? Anything could have made those marks, yet the size, shape, and amount of damage generally indicated something hitting it at high speed, internally. The door was definitely damaged from the inside. For a brief moment he had a glimpse in his mind's eye of the door springing open, seeing the astonished porter's face staring at him. Could it have been himself inside the locker? He looked down at his feet, a tag attached to his big right toe. He was wearing a grey shroud. One thing he was becoming aware of was that he needed to get away, out of the claustrophobic hospital, with its smell of antiseptic and brightly lit corridors. He needed open spaces, trees and grass, birds and animals, natural things. He needed the TARDIS as well. TARDIS? What exactly was the TARDIS? Oh well, whatever it was, he guessed he would know when he found it. He began to rummage through some of the open lockers. Theft was not exactly moral either, but these clothes were not being used, and he reasoned that he could return them later. Perhaps the TARDIS had a wardrobe where he could find his own clothes. The first locker he opened had a pile of clothes neatly folded inside a couple of plastic bags, marked with the name Walker General Hospital. He could see a rather shabby tweed sports coat, hideous leather patches on the elbows, a pair of loud check trousers and a white shirt. They looked very familiar, but obviously would not fit him. They were the clothes of a much smaller man. Perched on top of the pile was a straw hat. He reached out and touched it, and something in his mind clicked. He could suddenly see someone wearing the hat. Indeed, all these clothes. Standing outside a large blue box. The place was dark, but the small man was holding a strange casket of some sort. Something else familiar. He let go of the hat and the vision vanished. He picked up the hat again, but this time nothing happened. Nevertheless, it had given him some information. He decided he would keep the hat, just in case. The next locker contained a costume of some sort, encased in a special plastic clothing wrap, hanging neatly. Inside was what appeared to be a tan-coloured cowboy outfit. He quite liked the look of the grey velvet cravat, with its gold stud which was stuffed at the bottom of the bag. He also reached for a large brown Victorian frock coat. Miranda Gerhardt was awoken by the noise of her husband closing a drawer next to their wardrobe. She glanced sleepily over at the green LED figures on their bedside clock. It was 8:45. "Bit early, darling," she murmured. Bruce didn't reply. He was standing, apparently gazing at himself in the full-length mirror on the inside of the wardrobe door. He'd evidently showered, because his beautiful black hair was perfectly gelled and slicked back. Normally it stuck up in ridiculous directions first thing in the morning. Discarded on the floor was the shirt he'd noisily retrieved from the drawer. She stared hard at his naked back and smiled at his body, muscles toned, skin tanned. Miranda slid across onto his side of the bed, trying to catch his reflection in the glass. His side of the bed was cold. He must have been up for a good half an hour. Still unable to see his face, she spoke softly, and, she thought, alluringly. "Hi, honey?" "This body won't last long," Bruce whispered. "Another few years yet, Bruce. I'll still love you when you're wrinkled and chubby." Miranda went back to her warmer side of the bed, wrapping the quilt around her tightly. Bruce just ignored her. "I need the doctor's body," he sighed. Miranda grinned and sat up, then got onto her knees, still tugging the quilt around her. "You could do with a body that doesn't snore, sure, but you don't need a doctor." She cooed slightly. "Come on, honey, let's get back to bed." Bruce did not turn, but spoke louder. "My name isn't Honey." Miranda giggled. "What should I call you then?" "Master will do." Bruce turned to face her, and the first thing that went through her mind was that he was not smiling. That, and the fact that his eyes were suddenly bright green, shining and slightly elliptic. Large dark pupils in a sea of luminance. The next thing that went through her mind was that Bruce's right hand was round her throat, cutting off her air, her voice. She tried to kick out, to struggle, but realized he'd lifted her off the ground. She was blacking out. The master let the woman drop as he turned back to the wardrobe. He rummaged inside for a while, finding a pair of denim jeans and a check shirt. Slung over a chair by the bed was the black paramedic's jerkin that his host body wore the night before. Yes, he had been in the ambulance and had taken the doctor to that hospital. He ought to be able to retrace this Bruce's steps and use his identity to track down his old enemy. He looked down at Bruce's medical bag and decided it might be appropriate to carry it. The master touched his new skin. It was only human, and it felt like walking around in a cadaver. Before too long it would begin to decompose as any dead human would. He needed a Time Lord body to inhabit, and he knew exactly where to find one that he could utilize with no future problems. Pete was pointing at the wrecked door while Grace was examining the damaged gurney. It simply wasn't the same guy, Dr. Holloway." Grace stood up, running a hand through her blonde hair, and shrugged. "Strikes me, Pete, that you saw the guy who stole the body." Pete shook his head. "No way. He was wearing a shroud and that JD tag on his toe." Grace folded her arms and looked Pete directly in the eye. "Somehow I don't believe the second coming is likely to happen here." "Yeah, right." Pete smiled for the first time. "He'd go to a better hospital." He turned to go back to his office, but then he turned back to Grace. "I know what I saw." Grace just smiled. "Yeah, okay, Pete. Pop by psychiatric on your way home. Pick up some mind-altering drugs, all right?" Pete turned away, muttering. Grace smiled and headed back to her office. She called the lift that would take her back to the ground floor. She was still thinking about the strength needed to rip a sealed morgue door off its hinges like that, when the lift doors opened and she got in. The first thing that greeted her when the doors reopened was a long line of outpatients or relatives queued up waiting for this morning's emergency room business. Walking towards her was Shelley Curtis, looking remarkably fresh, presumably having caught a few hours more sleep than Grace had. She was taking over from the receptionist, and as she settled down, Grace leaned across the desk. "Can you believe this? Some creeps made off with that John Doe from last night." Curtis screwed her face up. "Ew. Body snatchers." Watching this exchange, he recognized the tall blonde from somewhere, but where? For a moment he suddenly saw her, gowned and masked as if leaning over him. He looked around himself now. He was in a hospital. Perhaps he'd had an accident. That might explain why he could remember very little, and why even his own face seemed unfamiliar. He had to talk to her, and stood up from the line of patients and headed towards the reception desk, but stopped when his target began talking to another man who hurried over, telling the receptionist not to call the police. "But Dr. Swift, if someone's stolen a body—" she said, but this Dr. Swift shook his head. Then he turned to the blonde doctor. "Dr. Holloway," he was saying, "can you give me some of your valuable time?" Time. That was it. Or was it? Something to do with time. He glanced over at the clock on the wall. 10:22 a.m. it read. December 31st. Grace allowed herself to be escorted into her own office by the hospital's administrator, slightly bewildered at his haste. "Roger," she tried to say. "Roger, we have to call the police." He held his hand up, cutting her off. Crossing to the X-rays still on her light box. "We don't need to advertise our mistakes, do we?" He took the X-rays down. Grace frowned. "What are you saying?" Swift looked out of her office, and then back at her, a false smile on his face. He held up the X-rays. "2 hearts, Grace. No wonder you got lost." "Exactly." "Or," he said, still smiling, using that look Grace knew he reserved for dying elderly patients who wanted to donate their life savings to his hospital, "maybe this really is a double exposure. Jim Salinger seems to think so." "Jim Salinger would," Grace retorted. "He has about as much imagination as a mouse and half the guts. He wouldn't say what he really thinks." "Nevertheless, Grace, I can't afford to lose you." Swift took a pair of scissors off Grace's desktop. Grace reached out, grabbing his hand, frowning. "What are you going to do?" "What you should have done last night." Swift neatly cut the X-rays in half, then quarters, eighths, and then dropped the scissors back onto her desk. He placed the fragments of the X-rays into his pocket. "I'll be visiting the furnace soon, I think, just to be certain." Grace stared open-mouthed. Then she stepped back towards the wall in bewilderment. "Am I having a bad dream here? I lose a patient, then his body, and now you destroy the only proof." Swift held up his hand to stop her, still smiling insincerely. "That you were careless." "That I had no way of knowing," she continued angrily, "that he had—" "Stop!" Swift stopped smiling and scowled. "Sincerely. A man died last night because you lost your way." "You bet I did," Grace was nearly shouting. She reached across, slamming her office door shut. "You've seen those X-rays? The guy had 2 hearts. Swift just shrugged. "Let me take care of this, Grace." Grace sat down hard. This had to be illegal. As big a malpractice as the one Swift was implying she'd committed by killing the mysterious man. "But, Roger, what was he? How can we learn from him? I have to find that body, and—" Roger Swift slammed his fist down hard on the desk, and Grace jumped in alarm. "And I have to keep Walker General open, Grace. At all costs." Grace shook her head. "No." She swallowed hard and looked him in the eye. "No, Dr. Swift. If you do this, I'll quit." Moments later, Grace looked up at the clock in the reception as she struggled towards the lift, her arms full of boxes and papers. Perched on top was a small plastic Mickey Mouse, a gift from her colleagues on her last birthday. The lift doors opened, and she stepped in. The Mickey Mouse toppled off and bounced onto the floor, and straight into the hands of a bizarre-looking man. He got into the lift with her, and replaced the toy on top of the boxes. Grace muttered a thanks and stared at the indicator as it went past lower ground, basement, and finally sub-basement, where the parking lot was. The doors opened, and Grace was puzzled to see the man follow her out. He tapped her on the shoulder, and her heart began to race. This was all she needed right now. Her can of mace was in her bag, but her hands were full. "Puccini!" The man smiled. Grace looked at him. He was in his mid-30s at a guess. He had rather sad-looking eyes, yet they were bright blue and quite attractive. He had a nice bone structure and a wonderful smile, showing a full set of good teeth. He was about her height, but with swept-back hair that looked as if he'd licked his fingers and jammed them into a light socket. It was his clothes that made her frown. He was dressed like something out of a Victorian movie, a chocolate-brown frock coat, a wing-collared shirt and grey velvet cravat. He also wore a fawn paisley waistcoat and grey trousers. His feet were completely bare, which meant, Grace thought, that they must have been feeling the cold from the rough concrete floor. "Going to a party, are we?" she suggested. The stranger just carried on smiling. "We've met before." "I don't think so." Grace began walking towards her car. "I do." He reached out to take one of the boxes, but Grace pulled back and the Mickey Mouse took another tumble. Again he scooped it up, holding it out to her. Grace sped up, willing to sacrifice the mouse if it meant she could get away from someone who had either drunk too much at a pre-millennium party or was an escapee from psychiatric. "There was music," he called after her. "Madame Butterfly, and you were there. I saw you last night." Maybe he'd seen her at the opera house and followed her out. God, somehow she'd picked up a stalker. Wonderful. She dumped the boxes on the hood of her car, but remembering her self-defense classes did not get the key from her bag. "Don't turn your back on him, Grace," she remembered. The man was still standing some way away. He was scratching at his chest, unbuttoning the waistcoat. "I don't know who I am, but I know you do." This gets worse and worse. A drunk stalker ready to expose himself. The year 2000 could only be an improvement on this. "Please," she shouted, "just go away or I'll call security." "You're my only hope," he yelled back. "Do you know who I am?" Grace slowly opened her bag, keeping an eye on the man. She felt the mace, next to it her keys. They were the better option. She felt them in her clenched fist and began to feel calmer. She lifted them out, transferring them to her other hand, and fumbled behind her, searching for the keyhole. "I have no idea who you are," she said. "I have never seen you before in my life." The key slotted in. "Now leave me alone!" The man stepped forward. "Please, help me. You're a doctor." "Was a doctor. My oath just expired." Grace heard the central locking click and hauled her door open. With one hand she hurled her bag onto the passenger seat and grabbed the boxes off the hood and into the back. Seconds later she was seated, and at a push of a button the 4 doors centrally locked again. She started the car up and glanced outside. The stalker had disappeared, hopefully having taken the hint. She'd just begun to ease the car out of its parking space when something landed on her skirt. She looked down to see the plastic Mickey Mouse. Peering into her rear-view mirror she could see the stalker in the back seat, his piercing blue eyes staring back at her. "Get out of my car!" she screamed. "My heart!" The man in the back doubled up. "There's something here!" Fascinated and unable to take it all in, Grace turned and looked. The stalker had ripped his shirt open, revealing his chest, rising and falling sharply. He was having difficulty breathing. Then she saw what he was protesting about. Sticking out of his chest was a tiny piece of wire, or at least it looked like wire. Yet as the realization dawned, Grace still could not accept what she was seeing. "What is it?" The man was clearly in agony. "Oh, God," murmured Grace. "It can't be." The man grabbed at it, and accompanied by a screech of pain, he wrenched it out of his body, letting it flop to the floor. "2 hearts!" he gasped. "I have 2 hearts! Please get me out of here before they kill me again!" He slumped forward, banging his head on the headrest. "Please," he said, almost so quietly she missed it. "You've got to help me." 3 stories above the parking lot, Shelley Curtis was idly waiting for the next emergency to arrive, when she was aware that someone was staring down at her. She glanced up and smiled. "Hi, Bruce. What's with the shades?" "I had a bad night." Curtis nodded. "Did you want something?" she asked him. "What happened to the gunshot wound we brought in last night? I have orders to move him." Curtis shook her head. "Sorry, Bruce, he died." "Yeah, they wanted me to get his body." Curtis thought this was a little odd. Why would a paramedic want to take a stiff anywhere? That was Pete or Ted's job. And who asked Bruce to do this anyway? Maybe she ought to check with... Bruce was picking at one of his fingernails, when it just came clean off. He flicked it away. "You okay, Bruce?" "Where is it?" he snapped back. Curtis decided this was none of her business. "The body's gone," she said simply. "Stolen." Bruce seemed to take this in his stride. Of course. If he died, then he regenerated. Curtis did not understand any of this, Bruce was acting very strangely. "Okay," said Bruce. "Where are his things?" "The kid you brought with you stole them from Grace Holloway's office." Bruce cocked his head as if thinking something through. The Asian child. Curtis was perturbed by Bruce's unusual tone. "Yeah, the Asian child." She stared harder at him. "Bruce, I think you really must be sick." Suddenly Bruce smiled. "Thank you," he said, turned on his heel and marched out. Grace's condominium was a large ground-floor apartment. "You all right?" she asked as she unlocked the door. "Much better," replied her charge. "Good. Especially now I don't have a piece of primitive wiring inside my cardiovascular system." He dropped a microprobe onto a small cabinet beside the front door. Grace wandered into her living room, ready to dump the boxes on one of her armchairs. Instead, she faced an almost empty room, with just a naked bulb swinging slightly from the ceiling. The only furniture left was an armchair and a coffee table. "I don't believe it. He's taken all his stuff." "Who?" "Brian." "Your boyfriend?" he said hesitantly, as if he was unsure that it was the right terminology. "Ex-boyfriend." Grace flopped into the armchair. "Apparently," she sighed. "Open your shirt again. I want to listen to your heart." "Hearts," he corrected. "Whatever." The stranger looked for somewhere to sit. Grace groaned. "He took the sofa. The little—" The stranger was looking around and pointed at a print of the Mona Lisa on one of the walls. "He left you that?" He walked towards it. "Leonardo had a terrible cold when he painted this." "How can you tell?" He smiled back at Grace. "I helped out. Made a few improvements of my own." He stopped. "Now how come I remember that?" Grace wondered if the trauma of whatever had happened to him was affecting his mind more than before. She pointed to a short set of stairs leading to a raised bedroom. "We can sit up there, come on." Moments later they were seated on the bed, the stranger having undone his shirt again. Grace had a stethoscope out and was placing it over his heart. "Maybe you had selective amnesia brought on by shock." "Maybe, I can't remember." Grace began listening to his heartbeat. "Shh." She sat up. "You're still fibrillating back." "No, I'm not. Here." He moved the stethoscope over to the other side of his chest. "Oh, God." Grace let go of the stethoscope. "See," the stranger said. "It's not an echo." "Two hearts." She looked him in the eye. "You were right. Who are you?" The stranger got up. "I was dead for too long this time. Your anesthetic almost destroyed the regenerative process." Grace cleared her throat. "Yeah, right. I'm going to take a blood sample and find out what's going on here." The stranger shook his head. "No, Grace, I have 13 lives. 12 attempts at getting it right." "So," Grace smiled, "so you're trying to tell me that you came back from the dead?" He looked at her in complete seriousness. "Of course not. The dead stay dead. I regenerated. Eventually." "I'm sorry." She stood up. "You cannot turn back time." The stranger suddenly beamed, and Grace saw something beautiful in his eyes so full of life, whereas they'd been so pained, so ill just half an hour earlier. "Yes, you can, Grace." "I'm not a child," she snapped without meaning to. "Don't talk to me like one. Only children believe that crap. I am a doctor." The stranger took her hand, and she found she did not mind as much as she felt she ought to. "But it was a child's dream that made you want to be a doctor, wasn't it?" Grace was suddenly back at her parents' house in Sacramento, watching as an elderly doctor left their bedroom, shaking his head at her father. Daddy had gripped little Grace's hand tightly, and she could see he was crying. She cried too, not really knowing why, but realizing that the doctor who had been looking after Mummy had looked sad too. "Mummy's gone away, Angel," Daddy had said. "She's not going to come home, I'm afraid. Dr. Sankovitz did what he could." And although she couldn't really understand what Dr. Sankovitz could not have done, she knew that one day she would have to be a doctor and find out. Here she was, nearly 30 years later, and still they'd not found an absolute cure for cancer. But Grace had become a doctor, and had made sure that a lot more 5-year-olds still had their mothers and fathers to go home with at the end of the day. She was back in her condo, staring at the wonderful blue eyes of her mysterious patient. Chang Li wandered up to the police line, ducked under the table and went straight to the door. Police Public Call Box, it said across the top. On one of the panels on the wooden door were various instructions, how to telephone for the police in case of an emergency. Whatever this was, it was certainly bizarre. But if it belonged to the cops, was the little man a police officer? A private investigator, perhaps, or one of those weirdos who worked at the DA's office? Li touched the box and whipped his hand back in surprise. It was vibrating very slightly, letting out an almost imperceptible hum that he had to strain to hear. This was no ordinary box. He looked at the key he had taken from the bag of possessions he'd stolen. Even if it was the key to the box, it might be booby-trapped. Having survived last night's attempt by the other gang to wipe him out, he was not particularly keen on getting blown apart by a DA's box. He twisted the key in the door, and as it opened, the hum got louder. He had expected a tiny little box room, just large enough for him to stand in. What greeted him was impossible. Beautiful, but impossible. Everything was made of intricately carved wood, with lacquered panels. Brass switches dominated a huge mushroom-shaped object at the centre of the room, and when he looked up, he could see a high domed ceiling through the gloom. It was not very bright, and Li nervously spoke into the darkness. "Hello?" There was no reply. He looked back at the central shape and realized it was on a slight rounded platform, with 4 sets of double steps leading up to it. A brass rail surrounded it, and on the side nearest him a tiny screen was flickering. This is too weird, Li decided, and was going to turn back to go out when the doors slammed shut. Li saw 2 tiny pinpricks of green light moving towards him. They got bigger. They looked like eyes. Then they vanished suddenly. Li realized that someone was actually standing in the shadows where the green lights had been. The figure walked towards him, and as Li's eyes grew more accustomed to the light and the figure got nearer, Li called out again. "Who's there?" "You don't want to know," came the reply, and the figure became recognizable. "Hey, Bruce," Li said. "Man, you scared me. This place is freaky enough, yeah?" Bruce was standing quite still, his head slightly cocked to one side. "Li." Bruce's voice sounded very strange, almost as if he'd hurt his jaw and was trying to get it working again. "Chang Li. Isn't that your name?" Li moved towards him, up onto one of the other sets of steps. Immediately the whole chamber was flooded in light, and the tall central shape began to light up as well, like a Christmas tree. "Well, well. The TARDIS likes you, Chang Li." Li looked around at the marvellous room he was in. The whole box was bigger on the inside than the outside. "Yes," said Bruce. "It's dimensionally transcendental." Li nodded. "Yeah, right." He looked back at Bruce. "What do you mean, the TARDIS likes me, Bruce?" Bruce smiled suddenly and removed his shades. His eyes were fierce green light, the ones he'd seen earlier. "I am not Bruce. I merely inhabit his body." Li was captivated by those eyes. They seemed to bore right into him, deep, deep down, as if they could see everything inside him, his whole life, every experience, every feeling, happy, sad, angry, hurt. He stepped back. "Stop that, Bruce! Hell, man, if you're not Bruce, who are you?" "I am known as the Master." Bruce, or the Master, pointed at the key Li was holding. "Where is he?" "Who?" Li frowned. "Oh, the guy who had this before? He died. All his stuff is mine now." "No," said the Master. "No, he's not dead, but he has stolen my body." "But—" The Master suddenly frowned and staggered as if he was hurting. I will die unless we bring him back here." He looked up at Li, pleading. "You have to help me get my own body back." "Yeah, right. And what's in it for me?" The Master just smiled. You get to live." Grace's strange guest had requested a shower, and asked if he could borrow a pair of socks and shoes. Grace had dug out an old brown pair of Brian's that he used for tromping around in snow or mud during winters. As such, they were stained and scuffed, and Brian had abandoned them during his hurried departure. "They fit," she heard the strange man mutter after a while. "Good," she grunted. "Keep 'em." "Thanks." "What do you think of my blood?" Grace looked up from a microscope and sighed, running a weary hand through her hair. "Well, it's not just blood." The stranger was pacing up and down the steps, muttering, "See, maybe if I walk about in them for a while, they'll stretch and I'll get used to them." Grace watched him for a moment, and then looked back at the impossibility she had on her slide under the microscope. Some fresh air would do her a lot of good right now. "Let's go for a walk," she said, getting up and grabbing her coat from the back of the armchair. The strange man beamed, his eyes sparkling. A brisk December walk in the park in the evening, just what the doctor ordered, as they say. A short while later they were seated on a bench, staring at a pond. He threw a small pebble into the water, watching intently as the ripples spread out to the edges. "Just who am I, Grace?" he said. "I don't know," she replied. "Maybe you're the result of some weird genetic experiment." "I don't think so." He stared out at the water, his chin resting on his hands. "Well," Grace tried a different tack, "do you have any recollection of your family?" "No, He suddenly sat upright. No, wait. There is something. I remember... My father?" He stood up, his eyes suddenly bright again. "Yes, I remember my father. I remember lying back in the grass with my father." He paused. The sky was burnt orange, rich and beautiful, and the moonlight made all the leaves glow silver. We lived on the south side of Gallifrey, near a mountain. He looked Grace straight in the eye, smiling. It was covered with the most beautiful daisies. Grace nodded. "This Gallifrey, somewhere in Ireland, perhaps? It sounds Celtic. Scotland?" She remembered the man who had died, the man whose body had the microprobe lost inside it. The man whose body had disappeared, only to be apparently replaced by this completely different, but very alive person before her. Could it all be true? "What else do you remember?" The man smiled, as if these most important memories were so vivid, so real to him. "Yes, there was a meteor shower that night. The sky was dancing with lights, purple, green, brilliant yellow." He sighed. "Yes, perfect." The man suddenly threw his arms into the air and twirled around, grinning happily. He stopped and bent over slightly, staring right into Grace's face. "These shoes, they fit perfectly, thank you." The Master waved his arms around the TARDIS. "All this was mine, Lee, mine, until he stole it from me." He looked back at Lee. "He should never have been here. He's changed things, moved my belongings about." "You know, I was told he was dead." The Master nodded. "Oh, yes. That body was dead, but now he's regenerated into another. My body can do this 12 times, but he has stolen most of the regenerations. Lee was having a job following this. What did he do with them exactly?" "Unspeakable crimes. I was on the verge of finally stopping him when we arrived, and—" He stopped suddenly. "What do you want out of your life, Lee?" "What do you mean?" The Master smiled, and even through the shades, Lee could see the green eyes glowing a bit brighter than before. "If you could have anything at all, in the universe, what would it be?" Lee thought about this. One thing he'd learned after a few years of dealing with guns and drugs, triads and gangs, was that the safest, most comfortable people were those with lots of money. A never-ending supply of cash. "I don't know," he began, hoping that the Master would be taken in by his indecision, and not think him greedy. $1 million? The Master laughed. "Only $1 million? How petty." "Okay," said Lee, realizing he'd misjudged this bit. $1 billion. The Master nodded. "Exactly. And what would you do with $1 billion? What would you buy?" Lee had no hesitation there. "Power." The Master smiled. "Excellent. And it could be yours so easily." Lee was now very interested indeed. This was really working out well. How? The master tossed him a little leather bag. Lee tugged on the tiny binding and it opened. Gold. Gold dust. You get the rest when I get my proper body back. A deal? Lee pocketed the bag and shook the master's hand, nodding. Deal. The master led the way out of the console room and down a vast corridor. The master stopped, suddenly pointing at a huge set of wooden double doors. He pushed against them with little success. Can you open these, Lee? Lee reached out to touch the doors with one hand. His fingers merely brushed the crack when they shot open inwards with alarming speed. Lee jumped back, amazed and momentarily frightened. How did I do that? The master smiled, his eyes glowing brightly once again behind Bruce's dark shades. I told you. The TARDIS really likes you. Come on in. This is my favourite part of the ship. Lee found himself in a fantastically huge room, with stained glass windows all round, carved wooden floors, and on the far side was a massive flight of wooden steps leading upwards. At the top it separated into two balconies, going right and left, which encircled the whole structure, meeting above the doorway through which they'd entered. Flaming torches flickered, giving the air a slightly foggy look. Intricate lattice work decorated the woodwork both above and below the balcony, and all over the walls behind it. In the centre of this was an ornate sculpture, carved from solid granite. It was an eye, closed, but very definitely an eye. It rested on a rectangular plinth and looked straight upwards. At each corner of the room was a much smaller eye, these ones open, and rising straight up from the centre of each was a 6-foot ornate sceptre. Near the top of each sceptre was a round mirror, curved slightly inwards, towards the major eye in the centre. What is it? The master smiled. It is known as the Eye of Harmony. It is keyed to the biorhythms of both the ship and its operator. And how can this Eye of Harmony help us find your enemy? The master looked towards the Eye of Harmony, running a hand along one of the mirror-supporting sceptres. The eye used to belong to me. Now it is used by him, so if we can open it, we'll find him. It will literally show us where he is. Cool. Lee walked over and looked down on the eye. So are you going to open it? No, you are. The master tapped the sceptre. Lee walked towards it. Just like that? Just like that. With a shrug, Lee flexed his fingers and then gripped the sceptre. Expecting some resistance, he began heaving, only to discover it slipped up and out of its mooring with ease. Carefully he laid the sceptre out on the wooden floor, making sure the mirror did not get damaged. From the hole in the open eye a thick beam of light shot up, disappearing into the wooden arched ceiling a long way above. The master was at his shoulder, speaking quietly. Look straight into the light, right up close. If the TARDIS really likes you, the Eye of Harmony will open. For you alone. You are a very pleasant young man, very trustworthy, decent. Therefore it senses it and responds to it. Lee walked towards the pillar of light and stared at it, letting his face get closer and closer. He felt a slight breeze on his face and could smell something nice. Jasmine. Herbs. Beside him, the Eye of Harmony began to open. The master asked Lee what he was seeing. It was a face. A man's face. He recognized the small, puckish features with their soulful eyes and toothy grin as belonging to the man shot outside the TARDIS the night before. That's the guy from last night. The one Bruce took to the hospital. He calls himself the Doctor. He has a brilliant mind, but uses it only for evil. The master urged Lee on. Can you see what he looks like now? Lee watched as the strange man from the previous night dissolved and was replaced by a slightly younger, longer-faced man. He had lots of dark hair sticking up and out. This new face possessed piercing pale blue eyes and something of a frown. The face expanded outward, getting larger and larger. In alarm, Lee stepped away, expecting the face to vanish, but it was all around him. The sky, the horizon, the ground. Something's happening. The doctor gasped through clenched teeth. In my TARDIS! He's in my TARDIS!" "In your what?" Then a huge smile stretched across his face. "Yes!" he cried. "Yes, I remember everything!" Grace smiled back. "I know who I am," he said simply, and hugged Grace tightly, kissing her full on the lips, passionately. Then he pulled back, embarrassment on his face. "I'm sorry, I got carried away." Grace shrugged. "Well, fine, whatever." Then she looked at him encouragingly. "Well, who are you then?" "I am the Doctor," he grinned. "I am the Doctor." He suddenly shouted up at the night sky, "I am the Doctor!" Before Grace could speak, he put his fingers to her lips. "In the TARDIS. The Master must have found a human body to inhabit." He suddenly slapped his forehead. "Of course! He's after me!" He grabbed Grace's shoulders, not roughly but certainly in agitation. "Don't you understand, Grace? He wants my body. He's going to take it so he can live and I will die." Then he stopped, crunching his eyes shut. "No!" "What now?" "He's using the Eye of Harmony to see through my eyes. I mustn't let him see you." Grace was getting more and more bewildered. "What's the Eye of Harmony?" In the cathedral-like room, by the Eye of Harmony, the Master and Lee watched as the Doctor's face distorted, changing to a woman's face. "At last," the Master whispered. "We're seeing through the Doctor's eyes. Now we can see where he is exactly." Lee frowned. "I know that face. She's from the hospital. She's the one I got the Doctor's bag from." The face was frowning, speaking. Concentrating, Lee realized he could hear her words, seeing and listening as he was from the Doctor's point of view. The image whited out, leaving nothing but stars, planets, and comets. The universe, Lee had seen it earlier. The Doctor had closed his eyes, Lee guessed, but he could still hear their words. "What's going on, Doctor?" the woman from the hospital demanded to know. "The Eye of Harmony. It's the power source at the very heart of the TARDIS." Lee could hear as the woman took a deep breath. "Okay, now then, what is a TARDIS?" "The TARDIS is my spaceship. It carries me through time and space. TARDIS, an acronym for time and relative dimensions in space." Lee was finding this almost as bizarre as he guessed the Doctor from the hospital must be. "And this Master," she was saying, "is he like the devil?" "No," said the Doctor, "he's a rival Time Lord." "A Time Lord." The woman then spoke quietly. "Oh my God, you're completely insane." "No, I'm not. The Master is pure evil. I was taking his remains home to Gallifrey, but he wasn't dead. It's all been a trap for me. He wants me to look into the eye." "So? So if I look into the Eye of Harmony, my soul will be destroyed. He will be free to take my body then." "Listen to all those lies." The Master was beside Lee, hissing into his ear. "Can you believe this rubbish?" "No." Lee was certain. "But how can she fall for it?" "Because," the Master replied, "he is pure evil. He is exerting his evil force over her, manipulating all her thoughts and actions, poor woman." "Look," the Doctor from the hospital was saying, her voice echoing around the starscape that Lee was gazing intently at. "I really can't deal with this." "Please, Grace, listen carefully." "No!" the woman, Grace, apparently shouted. "No, I've had enough. If the Eye of Harmony remains open for too long, this planet will be sucked through it." The Doctor was sounding desperate. Lee could hear why. What a load of rubbish. The Doctor was still shouting at Grace. "I must fix the timing mechanism on the TARDIS so I can close the Eye of Harmony. I need an atomic clock. Can you help me find one?" There was no reply. "Grace!" The image of the park suddenly burst back into the cathedral as the Doctor presumably opened his eyes. Lee could see Grace running across the park. "So that's how he intends to destroy me," the Master looked across to Lee. "We must find the Doctor before he finds an atomic clock." Grace was breathing deeply, half catching her breath, half trying to relax. Maybe Roger Swift had been right. She should have ignored all this weirdness and got on with her job. She'd call him later, apologize, and see if she could get her job back. She needed some normality, no matter how dreary, after the totally bizarre events of today. Back home, she was beginning to convince herself everything was going to be all right after all, when there was a frantic hammering on the door, interspersed with a very English shout of "Grace!" every so often. "Go away, Doctor," was all she could think of to shout back. "Stay away from me." "Grace," came the pleading voice reply. "Just let me in." "No!" There was a pause, and Grace moved closer to the phone. An idea was coming. A way she could be rid of this weirdo she'd encouraged by kissing him. "Grace," he started again. "Grace, if you let me in we can calm down, have a cup of tea and talk about this reasonably." "Sure," Grace yelled back. "Earth calling Time Lord, Earth to Time Lord." There was a pause and Grace thought he'd actually given up. She'd moved nearer the phone, grabbing her address book from out of her bag. She'd just reached the phone when he started again. "You're right, Grace." Success. "I am a Time Lord." Failure. She sat down and called back over her shoulder towards the door. "And I thought you were a doctor." "And I thought you were a doctor," came the retort. She made a decision and began punching numbers on the phone. "Listen," she said, "I'm going to call for an ambulance to take you back to the psychiatric ward from which you obviously escaped." "Grace, we don't have time for this. The Eye of Harmony is open, and if I don't get to my TARDIS and close it, this planet will no longer exist. I doubt the Master really knows what he's doing. I reckon we've got till about midnight, not long." "Grace!" he was shouting through the French windows. "I'm going to prove to you that the Eye of Harmony is open. Look at this." He pressed his hand against the glass and pushed. The glass stretched under the pressure like polythene, going further and further into the room. Eventually his hand went through it. With a monumental effort he pushed his shoulder and eventually his whole body through, and was standing in her living room. The glass snapped back into place, and they both turned to stare at it, unbroken and unmarked, as if nothing had happened. "You see," he said, "already the molecular structure of the planet is changing. At first in subtle ways like that, but soon it'll be catastrophic. By midnight tonight this whole planet will be pulled inside out. There will be nothing left, no humans, no animals, no trees, no flowers, no air, no water, nothing, Grace." He sat down. "Nothing to show your race ever even existed. Not even Darjeeling tea, Mum's apple pie or Hershey bars." Grace finally looked at him and spoke into her phone. "Yes, this is Dr. Holloway. I need an ambulance at my home right away. I need a bed in the psychiatric ward." She stared hard at the doctor as if trying to take in everything he said, despite disbelief at what she'd seen happen to the window could ever really occur. "Better make that 2 beds, she said, and put the phone down. The doctor sat in front of the television, grabbing the remote off the table. He began channel hopping. "News," he muttered. "Which is the news?" "Try KKBE," Grace said helpfully. "Channel 7. The doctor nodded. Good idea. He pressed the correct button and the face of a young dark-haired Japanese newsreader popped up. She was describing something called the Millennium Effect. All over the world freak weather conditions were occurring, for which no one could provide rational explanations. The doctor caught Grace's eye. "What will it take, Grace, to prove to you I'm telling the truth?" Grace was going to reply when she heard voices outside. The doctor was still engrossed in the KKBE news, so Grace slipped over towards the door. "And when we come back," said the woman on television, "we'll be showing you where the wealthiest and most fashionable San Franciscans are going tonight to see in the millennium." The doctor leaned forward, turning up the volume so loudly he did not hear the knock on the door. Grace opened it, putting her fingers over her lips. She was overjoyed to see it was Bruce. She pointed to the sofa where the doctor's back was clearly visible. Bruce nodded, understandingly. "They're going to see a clock. But not just any old clock. This is apparently the most accurate atomic clock in the world, and yes, it's right here in good old downtown San Francisco, at your very own Institute of Technological Advancement and Research. Now don't go away, because—" The doctor flicked the switch off, and jumped up to see Grace talking to a man with car keys in his hand. "They're here, Doctor," began Grace, but the doctor ran over. "Excellent! They can take us straight to the Institute." He looked at Bruce. "Do you know where that is?" "Of course I do," Bruce said. 15 minutes later, Grace decided that she was not enjoying her New Year's Eve in the slightest. She ought to have been at a party, dancing around someone's home having a good time. Definitely not racing down the road towards Walker General in the back of an ambulance with whoever was up front driving as if he'd never driven anything larger than a bicycle. Thankfully the doctor was being quiet, staring out of the rear window, hunched on the end of the stretcher in his ridiculous fancy dress costume, looking like he ought to be celebrating the end of the 19th century and not the 20th. "What time is it?" he said, looking back at her, a frown embedded in his forehead. Grace glanced at her watch. "It's just gone 10. She smiled, trying to humour him. Not long now and he'd be Roger Swift's responsibility, and she could head off to whatever party she could track down. "And don't worry," she added, slightly spitefully. "I'm on the board of directors at the Institute. They'll listen to me." The doctor turned back to his observation of the way they'd come, and Bruce frowned. Grace pointed at the doctor. He thinks we're going to find some sort of clock at the Institute of Technological Advancement and Research. The doctor suddenly swung back to her. Grace, if you know the board, why didn't you tell me you had access to a beryllium atomic clock? Grace floundered for a second. Think. I was more concerned and shocked by your discovery. Discovery? Yeah, you know, that eye of destruction. The doctor nodded as if that made it all clear. Oh, of harmony, he corrected. Got away with that, just. Yes, and the fact that this planet will be sucked through it at midnight. She smiled. Let's face it, how often does one have a Time Lord in one's living room, Doctor? She threw a quick look to Bruce. He likes me to call him Doctor. Freud had a name for it. Transference, said the doctor. That's very good, Grace. But I don't think so. Freud would have taken me seriously. Damn, he'd seen through her. Oh well, the hospital could not be far away. Carry on with the charade, Grace. Freud would have hung up his pipe if he'd met you, Doctor. As a matter of fact, I did meet him once. Well, of course, you are a Time Lord, after all. Another look at Bruce. She felt as if she needed some support, but he was just staring at the doctor through his shades. There was something very strange about them, she noted. Something not quite right. The ambulance suddenly shuddered to a halt. They'd either hit a red light at the last minute or just missed a car. She was about to comment on it when she saw more cars screech to a halt behind them. I guess something's blocking the road ahead. The doctor did not take his eyes off Bruce, and as Grace looked back at him he murmured something about time running out. My favourite planet's about to be destroyed and I'm stuck in a traffic jam. He suddenly leaned right forward towards Bruce. Do excuse me, he said, and grabbed the paramedic's shades, yanking them off. And then it dawned on Grace that she may have made the tiniest of mistakes, that she may have misjudged the doctor, and that whatever was sitting beside her was not the Bruce Gerhardt that she knew. What was sitting beside her had green, reptilian eyes that seemed to be glowing, lit by some kind of green fire behind them. Bruce, what's wrong with you? The doctor pushed her against the back doors of the ambulance, scrabbling for the door lever. He's the master! Grace barely had time to take this in because Bruce, or the master, or whatever he was, threw his head back as if gargling, and then forward again, spitting at her. And her arm was in front of her face, a reflex action that she realized later saved her life. A green globule of something splashed against her wrist, sending burning pain through it. She screamed in agony just as the doctor kicked at the door and jumped out, hauling Grace out with him. Grace found herself sprawled on the hood of a car, its driver clearly unable to believe his eyes. She looked back and saw the doctor grab a tiny portable fire extinguisher, letting it off at point-blank range into the master's face. With a screech he let go of the doctor, who jumped down and took Grace's hand. "Terribly sorry," he yelled at the bemused car driver, and began running down the centre of the traffic past the ambulance, heaving in and out of the cars, almost dragging Grace along with him. She pointed forward. "What are we doing here?" she yelled. They were almost at the Golden Gate Bridge. "This is nowhere near Walker General." "No," replied the doctor, "but I bet it's the right direction for the Institute." "Yeah, so?" "So, the master needs to get there to stop me getting that atomic clock." Grace was trying to understand. "So, Bruce is the master?" "Oh, I doubt it, Grace. Knowing the master, your friend Bruce is long since dead. The morphin creature that housed the master's consciousness probably took over Bruce's corpse. That's why he needs my body. Bruce won't hold all the Time Lord energy, plus it's probably decomposing moment by moment." Grace stopped suddenly. "If I pretend I understood every word of that, will you promise not to ask me to repeat it?" The doctor grinned. "Promise." They both turned in the direction of a police siren. Sure enough, a motorcycle cop was weaving expertly between the traffic, heading towards them. Moments later he'd stopped before them, drumming his fingers on his handlebars. "Now just hold on a moment there, sir, ma'am." He looked back towards the ambulance about 20 cars behind. "I think you ought to go back to your vehicle." The doctor stuffed his hand inside his jacket, presumably to get something, but Grace realized how the cop would see it. Sure enough, his gun was almost out of its holster when she threw herself between them. "Stop!" she cried. "He's—" What could she say? Of course, he's English! Standing slightly out of the doctor's eyeline, she tapped her temple, trying to suggest he was a bit strange. The cop nodded, slowly replacing his pistol. The doctor produced a crumpled and battered straw hat from within his coat. He offered it towards the cop. Grace could see a white paper bag inside it. "Would you care for a jelly baby, officer?" "A what?" "Just take it," hissed Grace, mouthing a silent "please" for good effect. The cop did as he was told, picked out a green one and began munching. The doctor meanwhile fumbled and dropped his hat, and then deftly caught it without spilling a single jelly baby. Grace was about to say something when she realized the doctor was now holding the cop's gun. No matter how surprised Grace was, that was nothing to the look the cop gave. He did a double take at his own empty holster, and then back at the mad Englishman with his straggly long hair, antique clothes, straw hat and gun. Replacing the straw hat inside his jacket, the doctor put the pistol carefully against his own head. "Now stand back, officer, or I'll shoot myself." The cop moved back 2 steps. The other drivers stopped their chorus of honks and toots, staring equally bemused at the scenario played out before them. "Now don't be foolish, sir." The doctor did not take his eyes off the cop, but it was to Grace that he spoke. "Are you with me?" A series of random thoughts shot through her head. She saw the doctor, the other doctor as she now understood, mortally wounded in the operating theatre. She saw him begging her not to operate. She remembered losing the micro-probe and then him. There was the parking lot, and the new doctor with the probe oozing out of his chest. The park, the news reports, the doctor forcing his way through malleable glass. And the master, in Bruce's body but able to spit venomous acid at her. Her wrist was blistered still, and she touched it, as if reminding herself that this nightmare was, indeed, real. "We don't stand a chance," she murmured. Still not looking at her, the doctor spoke quietly. "I came back, Grace. Back to life before your very eyes. I held back death. I can't make your dream come true forever, Grace, but I can make it come true today. What do you say?" For a tiny second, an image of her mother flashed through Grace's mind. Before the cancer, before the sickness, before she died. It was an image Grace had not seen before. If she normally thought of her mother, it was always as she had been in the last few memorable but tragic weeks. This image was far better. "Give me the gun," she said. The doctor hesitated this time, but only for a few seconds. Then he lowered the pistol and handed it to her, handle first. Without thinking, she pointed it at the cop. "Give me your keys," she said. "Oh, now listen, lady," the cop said. "Life can deal you a bad hand sometimes, but this is no way—" To Grace's astonishment, there was a yell from the various drivers surrounding them. "Give them the damn keys!" they chorused. His shoulders slumped. The cop passed his motorcycle keys to the doctor. The Time Lord turned to face Grace and smiled. Grace's heart beat a fraction faster as she smiled back. This might not be such a bad way to see in the millennium after all. As the doctor got the motorcycle moving, they heard Bruce's ambulance siren start behind them. Grace raised the pistol, but the doctor flicked out his arm, knocking it from her and over the side of the bridge into the river far below. "That may have been useful," she said, astonished. "I hate guns," he said, somewhat fiercely. "They go bang and hurt people." "It also would have made a good deterrent," she snapped back. "Do you know how to use one safely? How to load it, cock it, name it properly?" Grace paused, and then replied that she did not. "Exactly," the doctor said. "It might have been you who got hurt, and that I could not live with." Somehow that made Grace happy, and she clutched the doctor tightly as he revved the bike up and sped off across the Golden Gate Bridge, away from the approaching ambulance and the master. Her joy soon turned to terror as she realized that the doctor had about as much road sense as she had gun sense. He ignored every sign that demanded they stop, causing more than a few cars to swerve at junctions to avoid them. Eventually they saw a sign pointing right to take them out of the Lombard area of the city centre. At the last moment the doctor swung the bike right and headed for the Institute. "It's on the waterfront," Grace yelled, and the doctor nodded, seeing it in the distance. Speeding along, Grace could see over the doctor's shoulder. The Institute was getting nearer and larger, but she could also see another junction ahead, and the lights turned red. She was about to yell this observation out when the doctor shot straight through it, nearly causing another pile-up. "Did you see that stoplight?" she screamed in his ear. "Where?" he called back. "Doctor?" "Yes, Grace?" She sighed. "Unlike you, I only have one life. Could you please remember that?" Before the doctor could answer, they were shooting up the driveway towards the Institute, a huge concrete and glass modern set of buildings, built like Lego blocks and connected to each other by tubular walkways about 2 stories up. They passed a hoarding with the legend, 2000, the beginning of San Francisco meantime. They approached the largest building. All the lights were on and the music of a party could be heard, even over the roar of the bike. Grace noted various security people and media vans littered about, and she saw something else. "Oh no, Doctor, look!" Presumably having taken a short cut, parked beside one of the KKBE news vans was the master's ambulance, both doors wide open. 10 minutes later they were inside the institute, trying to look relaxed and informal. This is the first time being on the board of this place has ever been of any real use to me. Grace munched on a couple of vol au vent and took a glass of red Gioberti from a passing waiter. "You should try some of this, Doctor," she said. "Tuscany Valley wine. I went down to the vineyard once, watched them make the stuff." She smiled. "Got on very well with the owner's son, I seem to remember. Wonder what happened to him." The doctor did not answer her. Instead, he was scanning everybody in the dining room, and obviously not finding what he wanted. He must have found a back way in," he muttered. "We need to be back there." He pointed towards the empty presentation area, a raised dais cordoned off with red ropes. Grace nodded. "All right." She indicated the group television reporters with their camera crews huddled near the area. "If anyone asks, we're with them." "There's the clock," the doctor said, pointing directly above them. "It's huge," breathed Grace, slightly awestruck. "I mean, just how are you going to get that on the back of the motorcycle?" "We only need a tiny piece of it. The beryllium chip that moves the microchips, that are powered by the atomic particles, that built the house that Jack couldn't. Yeah, all right." Grace pulled him forward. "I gather time is not on our side right now." They were near a short stairway going up behind the dais. She glanced up at the clock encased within a glass box, and looking more like a piece of modern art than a timepiece. There was an access way behind it. "Tell me about this master. Why did he have to kill Bruce?" "He's on his last life, literally. Time and time again he's found ways of prolonging his final incarnation. Each time it's just been staving off the inevitable." The doctor looked down at his feet. And now he's realized that the only way to continue is to place his life essence into the one thing denied to him, another Time Lord's body. He's fighting to survive, Grace, and in that fight there are no rules. "You've known him a long time, then?" "Once. A very long time ago we were friends. Almost brothers. We shared so many ideals and so many frustrations. We both sought answers away from Gallifrey, but ended up diametrically opposed to each other." The doctor sighed and stuffed his hands into his pockets. "It's rather sad, really." Grace decided a morbid doctor was the last thing she needed right now. "I've seen the way up to the clock, Doctor," she said quietly. "We only have about half an hour." "I know, Grace, but we'll need a security pass. The hatchway up there will be electronically locked, and I don't have my sonic screwdriver to open it." They were now standing by the roped-off area, the stairway to their left, conveniently concealed to a majority of the guests due to a curve in the wall. "Here's our opportunity, Doctor," said Grace suddenly, and waved towards a rather elderly man. "It's Professor Wagg." Professor Wagg was wearing an evening suit that was probably last worn at a time when he was somewhat slimmer. His only hair was sticking out in little tufts above his ears, and a pair of pince-nez were in danger of toppling off his nose. In his hands was a glass of white wine, some of which was slowly soaking into his shirt, and a few crumbs of smoked salmon bake appeared to have attached themselves to his beard. He, however, looked as if he did not care a jot, as if his philosophy was for people to take him as they found him. Grace, nevertheless, knew it was quite a manufactured image, and adored him even more for it. Grace leaned back delightedly towards the doctor, but kept her attention on Wagg, as his face dawned with recognition. "He designed and built the clock. This whole thing is his baby." She moved forward, hugging Wagg. "Lovely to see you, Joseph." "My dear Grace, what a pleasant surprise. I thought you bored people only turned up at board meetings and the like." "Wouldn't miss a good party now, would I?" Grace laughed with him. "I brought someone to meet you." Wagg turned to the doctor, holding his hand out. "Joe Wagg, and you are—" "A pleasure to meet you, Professor." "Oh!" Wagg raised his eyebrows and smiled at Grace. "English. Good choice, Grace, my dear. Good blood in their veins." "He's a friend, Joseph," sighed Grace. "Not a racehorse. This is Dr. Beach from London." The doctor grinned at Wagg and pointed straight up. "Is there any chance of me getting a closer look at your delightful timepiece? I've always been a bit of a neurologist." "No, I'm sorry, Doctor," said Wagg. "I'm afraid I'm the only person allowed up there." The doctor put on his most seductive smile. "Maybe you could bend the rules just a little?" "Sadly, no." "Grace," Wagg said, "I like this one." He shook the doctor's hand once again. "Good to meet you, Doctor. I hope we'll meet again." "As do I, Professor, as do I. It's been a pleasure and an honour." "Oh, no, Doctor, the honour has been all mine." Wagg patted his shoulder. "Exactly." The doctor just smiled, and Wagg looked at Grace and then shrugged and wandered back into the crowd. The doctor's face broke into a wide smile, and he raised an eyebrow in triumph as he held his hand out. Nestling in the palm was a small plastic card with an encrypted microstrip along it. Joseph's security pass? Grace was astounded. Pleased, but astounded. I don't want to know how you learned to do that. The doctor flicked his head towards the stairway. Shall we go? Grace nodded, and they climbed over the rope, checking no one had noticed them. Luckily, all the other guests were too busy fawning over Professor Wagg or the television camera crews to notice much of anything. The doctor turned the corner and climbed the stairs. They were now standing in one of the glass corridors that linked the various buildings which made up the Institute. Outside, the dark night was punctuated by the orange glow of downtown San Francisco and the tiny moving lights. Beautiful view, isn't it? The doctor said. Grace moved towards the closed hatchway and slid the card through a slot, and the hatchway slid back, revealing a tiny access area at the back of the atomic clock. The doctor was down immediately, using a tiny coin to unscrew the panel that would lead to the beryllium. As I said, where's my sonic screwdriver when I need it? He stopped and looked at Grace and then pulled the straw hat out from under his coat. This used to be mine. So it ought to have been with all my other things. Not my clothes, I know where they are, but surely the stuff in my pockets ought to have been put somewhere safe at the hospital. Ah, yes, those things. Grace tried not to look too embarrassed. They were sort of lost. Yeah, lost. Lost? The doctor raised an eyebrow. Somehow I think lost is a bit of an understatement. Oh, all right, snapped Grace. I'm sorry they were stolen from my office, from in front of me. Who by? A Chinese boy. He was with you when you were shot. He travelled with Bruce in the ambulance. And Bruce is now the master, mused the doctor. He looked Grace straight in the eye. I wonder if the boy is working with the master. The doctor turned back to the panel. Oh well, it couldn't be helped. Grace stared at his back as he struggled to undo the screws. She touched his shoulder. Hey, I really am sorry he got them. As I said, it's not your fault. More sentimental attachment rather than practical use. As the doctor twisted the coin, his other hand shoved the hat back under his coat. The panel fell back and the doctor steadied it. Grace peered in over his shoulder, but it resembled the inside of a computer board to her. Human anatomy she could find her way round blindfolded, so long as there weren't two hearts, but anything remotely electrical and she was lost. The doctor slowly inserted his finger into a tiny slot and eased out a wafer-thin silver strip of metal. Is that it? Asked Grace. The beryllium chip? The doctor began screwing the panel back into place. Sorted. Let's go. They quickly scuttled along the transparent tubes, looking for a way back into the dining area below. Grace kept looking behind them in case a security guard showed up. The doctor opened the door and they found themselves opposite the cordoned-off area, some way from the clock, on a balcony overlooking the dining room. The exit and the way to their motorbike was therefore directly below them. Grace touched the doctor's sleeve. You are for real, aren't you? I mean, I've been telling myself that all this is a dream, something not quite real. Maybe I bumped my head or I'm still at the opera house with Brian. The doctor moved back towards her, but she put her hand up to stop him. But it is absolutely real, isn't it? I'm stood here talking to an alien who travels through time and space, trying to help him stop his old enemy from destroying Earth. She shook her head. Have you any idea how difficult it is to rationalize that? To put together my training, my belief in science with something that's straight out of a bad 50s B-movie? The doctor just carried on grinning. Believe it, Grace. Truth is always stranger than fiction. Grace nodded. I guess so. They looked down onto the crowd. 30 minutes until the millennium, the doctor said to break the silence. Give or take a few seconds as that clock tries to work without its major component. Doctor, Grace hissed. Down there. She pointed towards the centre of the throng. There's Chang Li, the boy who stole your things. As if sensing her, Li looked straight up and saw them, tugging on the sleeve of the man beside him. Dark glasses, dark suit, paramedic's jacket. The master's with him, the doctor said. We were right. We'd best get out of here. How? The doctor darted back out into the corridor, straight up. Grace hurried towards him and found him looking up a fire escape leading to the roof. I hope you know what you're doing. They'll be here in a second. No, they won't. The doctor smashed his elbow into a fire alarm, breaking the glass and setting off what sounded like every alarm in the Western world. Grace stared at him. Why did you do that? The party needed livening up, Grace. Come on! He hurried up the fixed ladder leading upwards, Grace following a couple of rungs below, using her foot to shut the door behind them. Every second that they could not be found might be important. Lee looked from side to side, trying to track down the master. He caught a glimpse of his partner nearing the far door, but the panicking crowds pulled them further apart. For a moment he wondered if the master would desert him, but remembered that he, and not the master, had the ambulance keys. At the far end of the room, a bald man with a white beard was shouting and telling people not to panic. However, a moment later he vanished from sight, either knocked over by someone who was not listening, or giving up and running himself. Lee was right by the door now, and the rough security guard hauled him forward, almost throwing him into the cold air. As he scrabbled towards the ambulance, a black-gloved hand grabbed his arm. "Where were you, boy?" growled the master. "We must leave. The doctor will be heading for his TARDIS." Grace stared down over the edge of the building. They were only 4 stories up, but too far to jump. "Grace!" called the doctor from behind her. "Grab this!" She caught the brass end of a fire hose he was unspooling from inside the fire escape. "You are joking!" The doctor pushed her over the edge, and before she even had time to scream, Grace was plummeting downwards, gripping the unravelling hose, shooting faster and faster. The ground was getting closer and closer. At the last moment she screwed her eyes up tightly and prepared for impact. Instead, the hose stopped suddenly. Slowly Grace opened her eyes. Her feet were 2 inches off the top of a police car. "Grace, let go!" the doctor called from above. She dropped and staggered forward, her heart beating faster than ever before. She watched the doctor shinning down the hose like an experienced abseiler, and eventually he joined her. Grace was not sure if she was going to hug him for his inventiveness or thump him for scaring her to death. She decided to do neither, and they jumped off the car and began walking towards their abandoned motorcycle. "Just how did you know exactly how long that hose was?" was all she managed to say as he kick-started it. "I just made an educated guess!" he yelled as the cycle shot forward, weaving between frightened guests and guards fleeing the non-existent fire. Grace caught a glimpse of Bruce's ambulance trying to drive between the same people, but Lee was obviously not prepared simply to run everyone over, and the delay gave their cycle a good start. Before long they were back on the bridge, heading for Chinatown, where the doctor's TARDIS was, apparently. The doctor turned left towards a sign that said, Chinatown. "It's not far now," said the doctor, shooting down Jasmine Boulevard. He turned sharply into Rose Alley, but all Grace could see was a tall blue box, which in her considered opinion looked very out of place. The doctor skidded to a halt and they jumped off, letting the cycle fall over. "There she is!" The doctor was almost hugging the blue box. Grace read the sign printed on it. "A police box? What's a police box?" The doctor was patting his empty pockets. He even whipped out his straw hat and looked inside that. Grace smiled. "Now, even I leave a spare key in that secret compartment above the door," finished the doctor. "Grace, you're a genius." "Well, great minds think alike." "True," said the doctor, as he cupped his hands together. "Come on, I'll give you a leg up." Sighing, Grace allowed herself to be propelled upwards and ran her hands along the top of the TARDIS. "There's a little cubby hole above the capital P." Sure enough, as Grace scrabbled about, her fingers found a tiny hole with something inside it. She yanked it out and jumped back to the ground. In her hand was a strangely shaped piece of metal, like a miniature trowel, with a cross instead of a handle. "This is a key?" "Yes, thank you very much." He started to open the TARDIS. "Why a police box?" "Its chameleon circuit got stuck during a previous misadventure. I rather like it like this." "Very distinctive." As the doctor pulled Grace into his TARDIS, any lingering doubts she may have possessed vanished immediately. "It's certainly large," she said, noting the intricate candelabra and the wooden lectern. "Been to a rummage sale recently, have we?" The doctor was at the central console looking at a flickering screen. It showed the outside of the TARDIS and their abandoned bike. He flicked a couple of gold rectangles into some slots, and right on top of the console a holographic projection of something else appeared. "The Eye of Harmony," he said. Grace realized she was rubbing at her arm and slipped her jacket off. Where the master had spat venom at her, the skin had completely discoloured, going very green. A green rash was spreading further up her arm. She opened her mouth to tell the doctor, but he was punching a button on the console. The exterior view of the TARDIS vanished and was replaced by a blue screen with the words, "Timing malfunction," flashing upon it. "It's no good," he said. "We don't have enough auxiliary power even to move next door." The doctor began rushing around the console, his hands moving in a blur as he twisted, shoved, and occasionally thumped everything he could. There was no doubt that he knew every piece, every square millimetre of the console, but his movement suggested he was getting more and more frustrated. Eventually he flipped the panel open and looked inside it. "Sorry, old girl," he muttered. Grace assumed he didn't mean her, but was patronising the TARDIS much as Brian used to do with his old car. The doctor clicked his fingers suddenly. "Grace, the beryllium chip, please." Grace delved into her pocket and produced the tiny silver rectangle and passed it over. She tried to look inside the console without getting in his way, but quickly gave up, realizing it was pointless. She had no hope of understanding any of it. He suddenly pulled out a wooden box with a couple of frayed red wires attached to it. The beryllium chip was now lying on top, attached by a twisted paperclip. "That looks a bit low-tech," she said. The doctor continued attaching wires to the chip and plucking other run-down-looking things out of the console. "This is a Type 40 TARDIS. It can take me to any planet in the universe and to any date in that planet's existence." He shot her a look, beaming. "That's temporal physics." Then he turned and flicked the switch on the console. A little blue light beside the beryllium chip flashed. "There," he said. The timing malfunction message vanished, and on the hologram they could see the Eye of Harmony begin to close. The doctor peered at something else on the console. "Oh no," he breathed, and thumped the console again. It obviously made no difference to whatever readings he was getting. He looked up at Grace, his eyes wide and frightened-looking, just like his previous body had on the operating table. Eyes not used to fear. "I've got a horrible feeling we're already too late." Grace looked at her watch. "It's 11:48. We've still got 11 minutes. The doctor punched a control, and the holographic eye vanished, to be replaced by a hologram of the universe. It was beautiful. Millions of dots of colour, swirls of gas clouds, yellow suns. "There's no context," muttered the doctor. "I'll have to check." "What are you doing?" The doctor hunched over the console, his fingers tapping in commands, slipping golden squares and rods in and out of slots. "I'm setting the coordinates for 1 minute after midnight. If I'm right, the eye has already been open for too long and there is no future." He shot a look at Grace. "I only hope—" He stopped as the hologram of the universe flared and vanished. "Oh no." Grace tried to make a joke of it all. "Hey, you never said this thing was reliable." The doctor ignored her. Whatever had started happening can't be stopped merely by shutting the eye. "How come you didn't know that?" "Because," he said, "I've never opened it before." He shrugged. "Frankly, it's too dangerous to open. Simply closing it hasn't been enough, Grace." He looked really worried and started tugging at a loose thread on his jacket sleeve, wrapping it round his finger. "We have to go back," he said, suddenly. "Back to before it was opened. Maybe before we even arrived." "Well," Grace said, "this is a time machine." "No power, remember? The eye opening and closing has drained it all." "Oh, great. I'm sorry." "You must have some more power, or some other way of getting the power back at least. You simply must." Grace wanted to shake him, try to wake him up to the reality of all this, whatever that was. Either way, standing around with a look of having given up all over his face was not going to help anyone. "Think!" she screamed at him. When he moved towards her, it was so unexpected that Grace jumped. It crossed her mind that he was going to hit her. Instead, he grabbed both her hands. "Are you any good at setting alarm clocks?" She remembered the countless times Brian had asked, last thing at night, if she had set the alarm for the morning. She, of course, answered yes, only to wake up 30 minutes later than they ought to have. Brian, needless to say, resolved to take on alarm clock duty after 3 months of hurried mornings. "No," she said truthfully. "Oh, good grief," the doctor exclaimed. "But I'll try," Grace added hurriedly. "Thank you," he said wearily. "Now listen carefully." He sat on the floor, pulling her down, and flipped open a compartment at the base of the console, yanking out a metal box with a handle across the top. He opened it to reveal futuristic things that could only be tools of some sort. "We preset the coordinates," he was saying. "Then, just as we divert the power from inside the eye itself, it goes through into the time rotor here." He pointed inside the compartment. "So," Grace said slowly, "to use your car analogy, we're jump-starting the TARDIS." "Sounds good to me." The doctor shoved his hand further into the compartment. "Now go over to the console where I placed the beryllium chip. Flip the top switch so that the blue light goes green." Grace nodded and stood up. She almost staggered. The sudden rise had made her light-headed, and her vision blurred as she tried to find the beryllium chip. She reached forward to steady herself and noticed her hand had gone green. That's not right, she thought. Her head was hurting. There was a noise in her mind. A voice? Telling her something? She closed her eyes, but all she could see were two luminous green eyes staring at her. "Pass me the neutron ram, Grace." What was that? The doctor? But he sounded so far away. The other voice in her head was louder, more compelling, commanding her attention. "Kill the doctor," it said. So simple a command. Kill the doctor, kill the doctor. The green eyes urged her on. She opened her eyes. Everything around her had taken on a green hue, as if she were looking through tinted glass. The doctor's annoying voice moaned on again, demanding his neutron ram. Stupid man. Stupid TARDIS, stupid neutron ram. The voice in her head was right. Kill the doctor. Grace reached out and grabbed something off the top of the console and smashed the doctor across the back of the head with it. Soundlessly he crumpled to the floor, dropping whatever it was he was wiring together. "Very good, Miss Holloway," said the voice in her head. Except it was no longer in her head. It was in the TARDIS with her. She turned to look. There, in the doorway, was that Chinese boy, and beside him, green eyes glowing brightly, was the Master. Very good indeed. Lee eased forward, leaning over the doctor's unconscious body, and pushed open the wooden doors to the Eye of Harmony area, and the doctor groaned. Lee stopped pushing the gurney, and so Dr. Holloway automatically stopped pulling. She just stood, facing forward, seemingly unaware of everything that surrounded her. The doctor's eyes popped open, and he seemed to be taking in his surroundings. He tried to sit up and clearly recognized Dr. Holloway's back. "Grace?" Slowly the woman turned around and faced Lee, looking straight over the doctor and ignoring him. The doctor closed his eyes. "Oh, Grace, not you." Lee smiled. Their captive was totally helpless. The doctor was wriggling slightly as if trying to break the straps on the gurney. "You know, Grace, this really is no time to be playing doctors and nurses." Lee tapped his foot. "It's no good talking to her, she's possessed." The doctor peered down, trying to raise his head again. "Oh, it's you," he said rudely, and slumped back. "You ran off with my things." He hauled himself up again, and Lee thought he might have moved a fraction higher. He would have to check those straps. The doctor spoke again. "So where are they?" Instinctively, Lee's right hand tapped the pocket of his baseball jacket, feeling the bag secure inside. The doctor clearly noted this. "Oh, at least they're safe, then." "They're not your things anymore." Lee tried to sound angry. "Pretty soon everything round here is going to belong to the Master again." The doctor just stared back. He had bright blue eyes that Lee felt looked right through him, and he shivered slightly. There was something about that look that suddenly made Lee think harder about the doctor. He didn't seem particularly evil. He was not screaming or threatening Lee. He certainly didn't carry a gun or anything. Of course he's evil, he told himself. This is just part of his tricks to put you off guard. "Again, what's the Master been telling you?" Lee leaned forward. "You know, when he gets his lives back from you, when he has your body, I'm going to be rich." The doctor nodded in understanding. "I see. And you believe him, do you?" "Hey, everything about you is weird enough already. Why shouldn't I? Can you make me a better offer?" The doctor shook his head. "Of course not. But I doubt he bothered to mention to you that there won't actually be anywhere left for you to spend all this money by the time he's finished. And that's why we have no time to waste." Lee recognized the Master's voice from behind him. "Time enough to change, I see," murmured the doctor. Lee turned to stare at his associate. He'd removed his paramedic's jerkin and now wore a long black velvet cloak with a high collar at the back. As the Master stood on the wooden balcony overlooking the Eye of Harmony, Lee felt a chill go through him. The Master suddenly looked as if he lived up to his name. His face was very sunken, however, as presumably Bruce's body was almost spent. The skin had taken on an almost translucent look, with blotches of discoloration showing through the cheeks and around the eyes. The lips were split, and one sore by his right ear was actually cracked and weeping slightly. Lee guessed that the Master did not really have much time left. He simply had to get his own body back before he finally died. I always like to dress for the occasion, Doctor, you know that. The doctor snorted derisively. You always had a flair for the melodramatic. The master clicked his fingers, and Lee and Grace moved towards the steps and walked up to join the master on the balcony. All three of them looked down at the doctor. I never liked this planet. Just as well, the doctor retorted, considering it will cease to exist any moment now. The doctor looked over to Lee. What's the time, please? Time for me, the master said, to retrieve my rightful body and get out of here. He turned to Lee, placing an arm around the boy. And take Lee with me, of course. Lee realized how little weight there was resting on his shoulders. The master had to be standing, speaking, and moving through vast amounts of pain, and with huge reserves of resilience. The master smiled at Lee, and the boy saw the sores around and in his mouth far more clearly. Most of the teeth had decayed, and his breath was vile. Lee suddenly felt very odd and disorientated. He took a slight step back from the master. There was something very wrong, very frightening about what they were doing here. In his mind's eye he could see the master's reptilian green eyes, but they were losing their brilliance, as if they were fading away as Bruce's body died. He felt as though some great weight was lifting from his mind. But what did it mean? Surely he had wanted to stay with the master, get rich and become that billionaire. In the pocket of his trousers he could feel the small bag of gold dust. Was that really what he wanted? Or had the master somehow convinced him that that was all there was in life? Lee needed to get away, he decided. He needed time to sort this out. Mere moments ago it had all seemed so right, so normal. Now it was frightening him. He stepped backwards down the steps and stood next to the doctor's gurney, looking up at the master. The doctor's fingers tapped his hand, and Lee stared down at him. Lee, this is my TARDIS. This is my Eye of Harmony, and I am in my own body. Don't listen to him, called the master. I am your friend. The master has run out of lives, and now he plans to steal mine. That's the truth. The doctor struggled. We have to stop him. The master bellowed out another order. Move him into position, Lee. Staggering slightly, he turned. Go and help, Miss Holloway. As she descended the steps, Lee looked from the doctor to the master. The doctor tapped his hand again. Look at Grace, he hissed urgently. She is possessed by pure evil, not goodness. Dr. Holloway now produced a weird object from behind her back and attached it to the doctor's head. It was like a metal crown with spikes sticking out from it. To this Dr. Holloway calmly attached two curved arms. These were placed neatly around his eyes, like some nightmarish pair of spectacles. She turned a key on the rods, and Lee realized the doctor's eyes were being forced open, and he swallowed, thankful that he had never caused the master this kind of displeasure. The master leered down over the doctor. This won't hurt, Doctor, he smiled, showing his decayed teeth and bleeding gums. Well, not much, anyway. Shelley Curtis, in her Georgian gown and wig, looked out of the room where the party was in full swing, searching for Jim Salinger. Angela Wheeler came up behind her. Marvellous job they've done in here, she said, brushing a few crumbs of cake off her pink Energizer bunny costume. Shelley let the door close. Yeah, I knew this old ward would come in handy for something. She sighed quietly, and Curtis noticed that Pete from the mortuary was wandering drunkenly towards them. He was dressed, he claimed, like Richard Nixon, but in fact looked just like an inebriated Pete in a suit. Still, thought Curtis, that was pretty fancily dressed for him. Hello. He breathed what smelled like half a bottle of bourbon over the two of them. Ted hurried over, his Wild Bill Hickok costume notably missing. Hey, Pete, your barber's getting off with Batman over there. With a snarl, Pete hobbled back the way he'd come. Ted smiled at the two nurses. She's not really, he said soberly. But I know what he's like when he's had too much, and you two look like you needed rescuing. Curtis smiled. Thanks, Ted. Seen Jim Salinger yet? No, he's going to miss the Big 12 if he doesn't get a move on. Curtis glanced at the clock. It read 11:55. Ted was still talking to Wheeler, explaining how he and Pete had moved all the beds and scaffolding out earlier that afternoon and set the party up when Jim Salinger bustled in. He was still trying to get his Lone Ranger mask in place and looked very harassed. I've tried calling Grace, he said, but there's no answer. I thought she had a machine. Curtis shrugged. If Brian's walked out, he probably took it. He struck me as the kind who would. Right. Salinger glanced around, nodding appreciatively. He tapped Ted's shoulder. Good job you done in here, Ted, thanks. My pleasure. Ted and Wheeler rejoined the main throng, preparing to get champagne ready for the stroke of midnight. Curtis kissed Salinger's cheek. "Happy New Year, Jim." "Well, it will be if you do that more often," he replied. She said. "You're not my type." "I'm fully house-trained," he protested. "Yeah, and I bet you say that to all the girls," Curtis grinned. "I'm sure you are, but my husband might object, and you wouldn't want to pick an argument with a construction worker, would you?" "Guess not," Jim laughed. "Come on!" Curtis dragged him towards Angela Wheeler. "Let's party!" Within the massive society party at the Institute of Technological Advancement and Research, Professor Joseph Wagg stood on the podium. After the excitement of the false fire alarm, he was relieved to be still there. He was staring out at the expectant sea of faces, all waiting to hang on his every word, to cheer and applaud every time he so much as breathed loudly or coughed. He was a little more interested in making sure the newscasters got it all, and shifted his position so he was more in direct view of them. "Ladies and gentlemen, friends and associates, tonight you are here to witness the culmination of my life's work." He crossed his fingers and hoped nothing was going to spoil his big moment. The possessed Dr. Holloway was helping Lee haul the struggling doctor across the wooden floor of the cathedral and towards the eye. "Up here," goaded the master, indicating that they should bring him to the balcony overlooking the Eye of Harmony. As the doctor began to struggle again, Grace pushed him forward and onto his knees. Lee then helped her to lift him bodily and push him against the ornate latticework, directly above the stairs. Dr. Holloway took his left arm and threaded the straps through the latticework and around his wrist. Lee did the same to his right wrist, and moments later both his legs were similarly bound. The master was on the floor next to the Eye of Harmony now, looking up at his prisoner, held onto the upper wall by just the 4 straps. Lee could see the delight on the master's face, and the pain on the doctor's. The gold in his pocket seemed heavier than ever before. The master indicated for Lee and Dr. Holloway to come back down. As they joined him, all 3 crossed to the mirrored sceptres, moving all but the one that Lee had removed earlier, into a new arrangement. "Perfect," the master coughed. "Just perfect." He crossed to the steps and reached up with an unsteady hand as if to bless the doctor's faraway feet. "A new body at last, Doctor. My gratitude." He began climbing the stairs, looking back over his shoulder. "Open the Eye of Harmony, Chang Li, while I prepare myself for a new lease of life." Lee began to approach the plinth from which he'd taken away the sceptre earlier, and as he did so his eyes locked with the doctor's, and all he could think about was how uncomfortable he was with all that gold dust in his pocket. At the Institute, Professor Wagg was tapping his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," he was saying, "both here at the Institute of Technological Advancement and Research and the millions watching us at home, it is 3 minutes to midnight. In exactly 180 seconds, the world will enter a new millennium. And with it, a new standard of accuracy will come to show how we measure time." He stopped as a pretty young lady tapped him on the shoulder. He threw a quick look at the television cameras and smiled. "Excuse me." The crowds heard a gasp from Professor Wagg. "What do you mean it won't start?" Chang Li was staring ahead, knowing that any second now the eye would open again and its power would be directed, as the master had arranged, straight into the doctor's forced open eyes, effectively stealing his life from him, back into the master's own form. His friend would have his proper body back. Or would he? Why was this suddenly so confusing? "This is your last chance, Lee," called the weakened doctor. "No, Doctor," he replied, trying to sound cool. "Relaxed. This is my only chance." He placed his face towards the energy. All he had to do was actually enter it, and he would soon be hearing the Eye of Harmony open once more. He would also hear all the energy flooding upwards, spreading outwards, and the master would live again. The master jeered at the doctor. "He's right, Doctor. There is nothing for him here. He has no family, no real friends, and no future. Only death awaits him on the streets outside. But with me as his guide and mentor, he'll get to see the entire universe." The doctor tried to move to look down at the master. "This is his last chance to stay alive, and you know it." The master stepped back quickly, almost shouting. "What do you know of last chances, Doctor? More than you." "Oh, you're so insufferably good, aren't you, Doctor?" The The Master was screaming now. "Always ready to sacrifice yourself for the good of everyone else, you sanctimonious hypocrite. Why aren't you willing to sacrifice yourself for me?" The Doctor was looking at Lee again, but all he could do was watch the Master, mesmerized by his sudden outburst. And Lee felt his mind clearing, the green eyes almost totally gone. The Doctor spoke softly, but Lee still heard him. "Because you're not worth it." The Master slammed his fist against the lower wall. "I have wasted all my lives because of you, Doctor. Now I will be rid of you." The Doctor jerked forward, smiling suddenly. "All your lives, Master? Didn't you tell Lee over there that I had stolen all your lives?" Lee stared at them both. The green eyes in his head were gone, and he suddenly realized everything. He had been used, twisted, bribed and mesmerized into doing what the Master wanted. But there was still all that gold. "Don't listen to him." The Master suddenly seemed back in control of his temper. The Doctor shouted loudly, "No, don't listen to him, Lee! He's used up all his lives, and now he wants to steal mine. Like I told you, this is my TARDIS, and this is my body." The Master pointed at Lee, his face twisted in fury. "Open the Eye of Harmony, Chang Lee! I am your master! Obey me!" Lee looked at the Doctor. He then looked at Grace standing below him, possessed. The Doctor's friend, forced against her will to hurt him and cage him, peeling his eyes back. That had to be agony for the Doctor. Was he like that? Was that what he'd become? Had life in the gangs really made him so easy to manipulate, so greedy for the next buzz, the next thrill, that he would ally himself with anyone? "Open the eye!" the Master screamed. "No!" Lee screamed back. "No, you lied to me!" He moved away from the eye. "You are evil!" The Master threw back his head and then spat forward, sending a massive green globule of venom straight across the cathedral. It hit Lee straight in the chest and flung him against one of the massive doors leading back outside. "If you've hurt him," yelled the Doctor. "You'll what?" sneered the Master. "Shout about it?" The Doctor let out a deep breath and spoke calmly. "So, how are you going to open the eye now?" The Master leaned over the balcony, looking directly down at Dr. Holloway. "Grace!" Slowly she turned and looked up at him. "Don't move!" The Master staggered down the steps again, using the last vestiges of energy in Bruce's reanimated corpse. Then he hobbled towards Grace. "Unless I'm much mistaken," the Doctor smiled, "that won't work in her present state of mind." "How right you are, Doctor," the Master replied. "Watch." He leaned forward and over Dr. Holloway's face. He seemed at first to be kissing her, but Lee realized he was actually sucking the poison back out of her. As he did so, her skin changed back to its proper colour. "No!" the Doctor shouted. "No, Grace!" Dr. Holloway staggered slightly, and the Master stepped back from her, his green eyes glowing brightly, infused with energy again. "Shut your eyes, Grace!" yelled the Doctor, but it was no good. Dr. Holloway was staggering, as if awoken and trying to get her bearings. The Master just grabbed her by the hair and shoved her face into the energy, spilling it outwards, where it began reflecting off the other mirrors. The Eye of Harmony opened, and its own energy poured out in a noisy rush and joined the light, beamed straight into the Doctor's unblinking eyes. The Master let her go and hurried back up the steps to stand directly before the Doctor and receive the energy as it shot through him, transferring the Doctor's life into him. Dr. Holloway fell to the ground, crying, scrawling around. "Blind!" she moaned. "Oh my God, I've gone blind!" "Your sight will return, Grace," the Doctor shouted above the noise of the energy flow. Slowly she looked up, but it was too late. The energy was already entering the Doctor's eyes, and then out and into the Master. "Ah, yes," the Master smiled. "That's better." Grace Holloway gazed up at the scene before her. The Doctor strapped above a wooden balcony, that Master person in front of him and bright beams of energy shooting around them. She could not understand how 1 minute she'd been helping him in the console room, and the next, everything had gone mad. What's happening? "The Master, he can't move as long as the eye links us. Remember, Grace." "Reroute the power. Yeah, I remember." The doctor was in agony. "In the console room! Go!" Grace started to move but turned back. "But you'll die if I leave you! And we'll all die if you don't! Please, go!" Beside her, the huge flat eye was opening wider, casting more light on both the doctor and the master. "Run, Grace! Run!" She ran, somehow knowing the right way to go. She didn't look back, but she could hear the master's maniacal laughter as he screamed in ecstasy. "I can hear your thoughts, Doctor! I can feel your memories!" The party at Walker General was in full swing. 30 seconds, Shelley," said Jim Salinger. "You don't need a construction worker when you got me." Shelley Curtis smiled and grabbed at Pete as he drunkenly staggered past. She kissed him hard, and he smiled brightly. "Wow!" Pete turned away and walked straight into someone dressed in a shroud from his mortuary, their face painted like a skull. He fainted. Shelley Curtis was looking at Salinger. "Sorry, Jim, but Happy New Century anyway." Everyone at the Institute was partying wildly. Professor Wagg stared mournfully up at his failed clock, and then back at his guests. "Oh, what the hell," he said. 20, 19, 18... The other partygoers took up the chant. 17, 16, 15, 14... Champagne corks popped, people yelled and pumped hooters. 13, 12... Shelley Curtis was hugging Ted, Angela Wheeler and Jim Salinger. "Group hug!" she shouted, and loads of other guests moved toward them, making a huge ball of people in the centre of the room, all shouting. 9, 8, 7... "Happy New Century!" yelled Salinger. "It's gonna be great!" 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1... Midnight! The world died as time imploded, wiping out everything on Earth in a millisecond, reversing it as if it had never existed. Reality throughout the space-time continuum shuddered and heaved as one small planet and all the effect it had ever had or ever would have on the rest of the universe ceased to be. Reality changed, and the planet Earth was gone. Grace was thrown from side to side as she tried to find her way through the maze of TARDIS corridors. All she could think about was the trapped doctor, and what he had said in the park. "If I look into the Eye of Harmony, my soul will be destroyed. He will be free to take my body then." The TARDIS bucked violently, hurling her through an arched doorway, and she found herself in the console room. Whatever the master had started was now in the full throes of execution. She clearly did not have long. "Please, God," she muttered, half thrown, half throwing herself to the floor and rolling to the base of the console arches. She hauled herself up the tiny steps and round to the open hatch the doctor had been working on earlier. Abandoned there was the beryllium chip. "Reroute the power," she muttered. "Just reroute the power." She pulled some wires out. How? She began attaching various wires to the beryllium chip's new home, but the TARDIS lurched harder, and it gave her a slight shock. After a few moments she was getting nowhere, and could feel tears of frustration and anger welling up. "No!" she shouted, at no one in particular. "No, I won't let this beat me!" The master was soaking up more of the energy burning through the doctor. He was laughing, almost screaming with pleasure. "Alive!" he cried. "I am alive!" The doctor was barely moving. On the balcony the master began to blur and change. He seemed to split down the middle, his clothes and Bruce's body flopping uselessly to the stone floor, discarded. In their place, the master was just a silhouette of a man, arms stretched up, head thrown back. The silhouette flickered briefly, filling up with images of planets, stars, swirling gas clouds, as if the universe was contained within the humanoid outline of the master. Seconds later the silhouette began to glow, leaving the master standing as a solid white shape, a sort of bleached-out reflection of the doctor's outline, coat-tails trailing in the wind, the cravat undone and blowing loosely round his neck. Gradually a face began to form, featureless, like an incomplete clay model. Grace had run out of wires to check, to link up. She slammed her fist against the side of the vibrating wooden console angrily. A red wire flopped down from inside, one she had not touched before. "Please!" She attached it to the beryllium chip, and a massive spark sent her flying back down the steps. The lights in the console room dipped dramatically, but the vibrating stopped. The top of the console suddenly flared white, and a wave of heat washed across her. She smelt burning, and saw that the wire and the beryllium chip were distorting under the heat. "No!" she shouted impotently, as if it would stop at her command. Then the time rotor atop the console began to rise and fall, and this was accompanied by a bizarre wheezing and groaning sound. Slowly, as the heat and light around the console faded, Grace lifted her head up, gazing over at the monitor suspended above her. The fascia was cracked and pitted, and the glass screen was fragmented. On the console in front of her, the figures on the digital clock began racing around. What now, she wondered. The light from the eye diminished suddenly. "She did it," the doctor breathed. "Grace, you did it!" He stared down at the master, his face racked with pain, but his forced open eyes blazed in triumph. "Your life force is dying, master." "No!" came an unearthly gurgling screech nearby. It could only be the master, but he was mid-transformation, unfinished and indistinct. He stumbled down the steps towards the eye. "More power! I need more light! I'm nearly there!" Grace was frantically punching at the console, twisting dials and sliding rods and rectangles into the antique-looking slots, trying to stop the clock. "Think alarm clock, Grace. Think alarm clocks!" The screen above her suddenly flashed a new message. "Entering temporal orbit." What the hell is a temporal orbit? She hit the console and the clock stopped moving. How am I supposed to understand any of this? As the clock had stopped, she turned and ran out of the console room to see if she'd made any difference back at the Eye of Harmony. She ran in, noting Lee was still slumped there by the side. Dead or alive, she had no way of knowing. The doctor was still moving, however, and the light from the Eye of Harmony was still beaming into him, but with notably less force. Of the master there was no sign, but she could see something smouldering on the balcony, just at the top of the steps. Horrified at herself, she actually hoped that he had got what he deserved, and that was all that was left of him. She dashed up the steps, and then clambered up the wall, holding on with one hand as she started undoing the doctor's caged head. Seconds later he was able to close his eyes, as tears streamed down his face. She threw the hideous contraption over her shoulder, and then began concentrating on his bound wrists. She was between the doctor and the eye now, and could feel the light beaming into her. But at least she was shielding him. The doctor opened his eyes and grinned weakly. "You did it, Grace. Well done." "Doctor!" She changed hands, now loosening his other wrist. "Doctor, what is a temporal orbit?" "Why?" "Because we're in one." He gripped the lattice work as she bent down to release his feet. "Grace!" His warning was too late. Grace felt her ankle grabbed from behind. She twisted round and came face to face with something. It was a brilliant white figure of a man, but with no defined edges within its shape. She could see the outline of a collar and the tail of a coat behind, but it looked like a traced drawing. Only the face had any substance. It was a lumpy, unmade face, with half-closed eyes and a snarling mouth. However, when it spoke, she immediately recognized the master's voice. "What have you done, woman?" He tugged her to the floor, and before Grace could stagger away, he picked her up and hurled her down the steps. Grace tensed herself for a bad fall, and heard a dull crack as something snapped. Probably a rib or two, hopefully nothing more serious. She lay for a second, mentally checking herself. She was still breathing, hard but without difficulty. Her lungs had not been punctured. It might be painful, but she could still move around. As she staggered to her feet, she saw the master dashing down the steps, and the doctor, now free of his bonds, dropped to the ground, facing the bizarre new version of his sworn enemy. The master reached out, picking up a sceptre that someone had moved out of its plinth. He swung it at the doctor, who jumped up and over it. The sceptre thudded into the wall below the balcony, shattering the mirror, sending shards of glass everywhere. The master, using the sceptre like a fighting staff, smashed at the doctor again and again. The doctor was getting weary. Grace guessed that he had only a third of his normal energy after the battering from the Eye of Harmony's light. Then he fell back, and the master brought the sceptre crashing down. The doctor had fainted, however, and rolled aside as the sceptre smashed into the side of the eye, splitting in two. The doctor rolled forward, scooping up the other half of the sceptre in both hands. "On guard!" he cried, stabbing forward like a fencing champion. The master parried successfully, and the doctor fell back, dodging around the other side of the eye. Both Time Lords were now hidden to each other, the solid light from the eye shooting straight up. Grace ran to the doctor's side, but he pushed her back. "It's too dangerous, Grace. He'll kill you." "No, really?" Grace shouted back. "I'd never have guessed that. There must be something I can do." The doctor quickly pointed at the hole where the scepter ought to have been. "We need to cut off the energy supply and close the eye." He passed his half of the pole. "Block it up!" She crawled towards it, shoving the damaged scepter back in, ignoring the searing light and energy rushing past her. Immediately the light beams cut off, and the mirrors ceased reflecting. But it was too late to stop the eye itself. Instead of closing, more energy shot up and both Time Lords staggered back. "You can't win, Doctor!" screamed the Master. "My body is new, fresh and strong. Yours is weak, dying." "Oh, rot!" the Doctor called back. "I'm fine, and you know it. You, on the other hand, well, try looking in the mirror if you don't believe me." The Master quickly dived forward, just missing the beam of light, and careered into the Doctor, both of them rolling back. The Doctor was staring up into the Master's face, a sneer on his lips. "You want dominion over the living, yet all you ever do is kill." The Master laughed. "Life is wasted on the living, Doctor." He jumped up and grabbed the Doctor's collar, hauling him back into the beam of light, face first. Grace went to move forward, but stopped as the Doctor suddenly went limp. The Master obviously overcompensated and pushed the Doctor's body in the wrong direction, dropping him and staggering forward. The Doctor was free, and the Master had made his last mistake. His momentum carried him straight into the Eye of Harmony, the light hurling him upright into the air. The Doctor tried to reach out for him, but the Master was too far up, twisting and screaming in anger and pain, caught in the beam of pure energy from the very heart of the Eye of Harmony. Grace watched as his body was buffeted by the light, and then it started to stretch. The Master was getting thinner and longer, his screams fading, until in a flash of brilliance he simply ceased to exist. The Doctor moved to Grace, pulling her away and nearer to Lee. The light began billowing outwards, filling the area completely with golden brilliance. Her hands were glowing with the light, and she suddenly felt the pain in her chest fade, and her energy begin to return. The light faded from the cathedral walls and floor, and she blinked a few times to clear her vision. She realized the Doctor was hugging her tightly, and she could feel his breath on her neck, smell his hair. She tapped his shoulder, and grinning, he pulled back. "Hello," he said. "Hi," she replied. "Is that it?" That is a powerful force, the Eye of Harmony. Normally, any non-Time Lord should have been totally vaporized. You two did something I've never done. What's that? You cheated death. How does that feel? Grace smiled. It's nothing to be afraid of. She reached out and hugged him again. Over his shoulder she saw the Eye of Harmony close. The Doctor turned just in time to see this too. Incredible! He jumped up. What a sentimental old girl the TARDIS is! Grace began to relax. Think I figured out what we did. The Doctor sat cross-legged in front of her. Lee groaned and shook his head. His chest was healed, and in his hands was the bag of the Doctor's personal effects. "I think these are yours," he said a little sheepishly. "Thank you, young man. Good to have you back in the land of the living." The Doctor patted his knee. "Now listen. Grace is going to tell us how she saved the universe." Grace swallowed. "Okay, that thing on the console isn't just a clock, is it?" "Nope. It's some kind of chronometer, and a temporal orbit is like being dragged back in time but not space. You're getting there, a little basic, but it'll do. Okay, so what you got me to do, what you needed that beryllium chip to power, was to move this TARDIS of yours back to a point before the eye was first opened, therefore giving you enough time to close it without doing any real damage." Grace folded her arms. "Well?" The Doctor looked at Lee. "What do you think?" "Don't ask me, Doctor. I don't understand any of it." "Did we go back far enough, though?" Grace asked. The Doctor replied, "We must have done, or I'm talking to a couple of ghosts." 10 minutes later they were standing in the console room. The Doctor was hunched over the console itself, pressing buttons. The screen was no longer cracked, and the hologram of the universe was once again rotating above the time rotor. "Now, let's see where we are." The Doctor peered at the universe. Well, now, the future is roughly... He pointed vaguely in the middle. That-a-way. His finger moved across the representation. And that's home, on the other side of your galaxy. Gallifrey? Gallifrey. He smiled. Home. That has a nice ring to it. He looked at them both. It's 250 million light-years away. About 10 minutes in this old thing. He patted the TARDIS console. So, where are we now? Or rather, when? December 29th, actually, just before it all started to go wrong. He smiled at her. Want to get off here? And go through all that again? Muttered Lee. No, thank you. I wouldn't survive it. Grace thought for a moment. No, it means Brian would be at the apartment, and I can do without that, thank you. She smiled. Now let's go see the future. Shelley Curtis was hugging Ted, Angela Wheeler and Jim Salinger. Group hug! She shouted, and loads of other guests moved towards them, making a huge ball of people in the centre of the room. All shouting, 9, 8, 7... Happy New Century! Yelled Salinger. It's gonna be great! 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1... Midnight! Balloons fell from the roof and everybody screamed, whooped and yelled delightedly as they moved into the new millennium. The TARDIS materialized beside the bay in the park. The door opened, spilling bright light into the dark night, and 3 people hurried out, just in time to see the fireworks erupt all over the sky as midnight struck. From over the water and from the city, voices could be heard singing, Should All Acquaintance Be Forgot? I never liked that song, Grace said. Oh, I don't know, said the doctor. I've always had a soft spot for all things Scottish. He pulled his straw hat from under his coat, twirling it onto his finger. Should all acquaintance, indeed, he murmured. Lee held out his hand. In it was the bag of gold dust. The doctor reached out and closed Lee's hand around the bag. Keep it. Look after yourself with it. Lee was staring at the gold in his hand, shocked. Are you sure, Doctor? I mean, I tried to... Well, you know, the Master and... The doctor nodded. Yes, but that's in the past. Just make good use of your future. The boy grinned. Okay, then I'm getting out of here before you change your mind. He started walking backwards. See you around, Doctor. Dr. Holloway. Bye, Lee. They watched as he ran across the park until he'd been swallowed up by the trees and darkness. I'd better be off too. The doctor half turned towards the TARDIS. Do you want to come with me? Grace pointed back downtown. Do you want to come with me? The doctor glanced at the TARDIS, back towards the city, and then at Grace. I'm tempted. Grace nodded. I guess you are, so am I. She reached forward and hugged him, one last time, feeling his hearts beating, feeling his hands on her, hearing him breathing. She looked into his eyes. Clear, blue, powerful eyes. Strong eyes, no longer afraid. I'll miss you, she said simply. Not me, he said. I'm the guy with the 2 hearts. I'm easy to find. I didn't mean that. He put a finger to her lips. I know. She reached forward and kissed him. Thank you, Doctor, she said quietly. The doctor straightened his cravat and ran a hand through his hair. He passed his old straw hat over to her. And thank you, Doctor. Grace Holloway watched as the doctor walked back into the TARDIS and closed the door behind him. She smiled, as with that strange sound the TARDIS faded away, taking the Time Lord out of her life, as bizarrely and unexpectedly as he had entered it. Turning back towards civilization, she popped the hat on her head and wondered which party to make for.